The summer heat in Redding, California had a way of pressing down on everything like a hand that refused to lift. It settled into the cracked asphalt of Pine Street, soaked through the tin roofs of the old warehouses near the Sacramento River, and found its way into the shoulders of anyone foolish enough to stand under the noon sun without shade. By late July, the temperature had pushed past 104 degrees before most people finished their first cup of coffee, and the air itself felt used up thin, like something that had already been breathed too many times and could not hold any more heat without simply becoming the heat itself. Wade Callahan sat on the wooden bench outside Rusty's bar and grill and let the heat do whatever it wanted to him. His leather vest was dark with sweat stains that mapped years of desert highways and sleepless nights. At 44, his face told a story most people chose not to read. A thick scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, a souvenir from a night in Bakersfield 15 years ago that he never discussed. Not because it still hurt, but because nothing about it was worth the words. His beard had gone mostly gray at the edges, and his hands were so callous they looked like they belonged to a man who had spent his whole life apologizing to machinery. The Hells Angels patch on his back was enough to make mothers pull their children closer, when he walked past enough to make shopkeepers check their security cameras, twice enough to make strangers cross the street without fully knowing why they were doing it. He was used to all of it. He had been used to it for 20 years, and the weight of other people's assumptions had long since stopped feeling like weight and had become something more like weather, something you noted and adjusted to without particularly caring about it anymore. Wade took a long drag from his cigarette and watched the heat shimmer above the parking lot in slow waves that bent the edges of the world. 3 Harleys sat in a row beside his own, black and chrome and road dust. Inside the bar, he could hear Roy Briggs arguing with the bartender about the previous night's baseball game. Roy had a gift for argument that had nothing to do with being right and everything to do with volume and the willingness to outlast the other person. He was shorter than Wade, louder by about 30% in every conversational register, and had been adding roughly 10 pounds to his frame every year with the comfortable confidence of a man who had decided he was done competing with younger versions of himself and was satisfied with the version he currently had. But his loyalty was the kind you could not manufacture or buy or fake no matter how long you spent trying. They had ridden together since their 20s, slept in ditches in Nevada, and the Central Valley stood back to back in bar fights that neither of them started, but both of them finished with considerably more damage to the other side. Wade had come to understand over 20 years that Roy Briggs was the only person on earth who would tell him the truth, even when the truth was the last thing Wade wanted to hear. "You coming inside, or you planning to melt out here?" Roy called from the doorway, a beer already wrapped in his thick fist. Wade shook his head. "Give me a minute." "You've had about 40 minutes. "Then give me 41. Roy made a sound that was half laugh and half surrender and went back inside. The truth was that Wade needed more than a minute. He needed something he could not name, something that had been hollowing him out slowly for months. Maybe longer, like rust eating through the frame of a truck. Nobody had bothered to look at closely enough to maintain. He was not sick. He was not broke. He was not in any more trouble with the law than usual, which was to say not much. But there was a weight sitting in the center of his chest that no road had ever lifted for longer than a few hours at a time, and no amount of engine noise had ever properly drowned out. A feeling that every road he had ever taken in his life led eventually to the same empty parking lot, the same gray early morning, the same cup of coffee, in a place that was not particularly his, in a day that was not particularly different from the one before it. He thought about his father sometimes, though he tried not to make a habit of it because it did not accomplish anything. Leonard Callahan had been a sheet metal worker in Shasta County, big hands, a quiet voice, and a temper that only showed itself when he drank, which was every night after Wade's mother packed her 2 suitcases and left for Sacramento with a man named Gerald, who sold insurance and had a better disposition. Wade was 13 when he started sleeping at friends' houses to avoid the particular quality of silence in a house where a man was deciding each evening whether to be angry or just hollow. He was 15 when he left for good, walking out the back door at 2 in the morning with a duffel bag over one shoulder and no particular destination in mind, only the absolute bone-deep certainty that anything at all was better than staying. He heard his father died of a stroke 8 years later in a hospital room in Redding with no visitors on record. Wade had not gone to the funeral. He told himself he did not care. For most of his adult life, he had almost believed it. That afternoon, he rode north on Route 299, not heading anywhere with intention, just needing the wind and the noise and the blur of pine trees scrolling past on both sides of the road. The whiskey town's Shasta Trinity area spread out around him like a cathedral, built before anyone was keeping track of such thing. Douglas firs and ponderosa pines climbing the hillsides in dense silent columns, the air thick with the smell of warm earth and dried pine needles baking in the afternoon heat, the road curving along the mountain edge in long, sweeping arcs that required his full attention and gave his mind permission to go quiet for a few miles. He leaned into each turn with the mechanical ease of a man who had spent half his life on two wheels and trusted the machine beneath him in a way he had never managed to trust very much else. He pulled off near Crystal Creek, where a dirt path dropped down to a picnic area that had not seen a family in several weeks. The tables were weathered to a pale silver gray. Beer cans and a crushed chip bag lay scattered in the fire pit. Wade killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence for a moment, listening to the creek move over the rocks below, listening to the Stellar's jays argue in the pine canopy above, listening to nothing in particular, and finding that for a few minutes it was enough, and then gradually it was not quite enough anymore. That was when he heard it. A small sound barely audible above the water and the birds. Not an animal, not the wind working through the pine needles. It was the sound of a child crying muffled and worn thin, the way crying sounds when a person has been at it so long that the body has nearly exhausted what it needs to keep going, when the grief has burned through its own fuel supply and is running on something closer to reflex than feeling. Wade stood slowly, his boots crunched on the gravel as he moved toward the tree line. The sound came from deeper in the woods past a thicket of manzanita with its dark red papery bark and a scatter of fallen branches going soft with dry rot. He pushed through thorns catching on his vest and stopped. A girl sat with her back against the base of an old valley oak, her knees pulled tight to her chest, her arms wrapped around them so tightly that her small knuckles had gone white at every joint. She was no more than 7 years old. Her dark brown hair was tangled with leaves and small twigs. Her face was streaked with dirt and the dried tracks of many hours of tears, the salt lines crossing her cheeks in patterns that told him she had been crying and stopping and crying again for a very long time. Her thin cotton dress was torn at the hem and printed with faded yellow flowers that had probably been brighter when it was new. She wore no shoes. The soles of her feet were scratched and dark with mud, and some of the scratches had bled and dried in thin, dark lines across her skin, old enough to have darkened but too recent to have begun healing. She looked up when he stopped, and for one long moment her eyes went very wide with something close to panic. She saw the beard and the scar and the size of him and the leather and the patches and all the things that people registered when they looked at Wade Callahan, all the things that made them cross streets and pull their children close and check their cameras. But she did not run. She was too tired to run, too hungry, too far past the place where running was still an option. And perhaps she had already learned something about the world that most children do not learn so early, which is that the things you are supposed to be afraid of are sometimes the only things left standing between you and something worse. "I hid in the woods all night," she whispered. Her voice was barely there, thin as paper worn through at the fold. "I was scared of the dark. I was scared of everything." Wade Callahan, who had faced down men with genuinely bad intentions in worse places than this, who had ridden through mountain thunderstorms on two wheels and felt nothing but the pure mechanical pleasure of the machine beneath him, handling the road, who had once broken a man's jaw with a single measured punch in a parking lot in Sacramento and walked away from it without particular feeling, felt something crack open inside his chest. Something that had been sealed for a very long time, sealed so thoroughly and so carefully that he had stopped being aware of the sealing and had begun to mistake it for the natural condition of things. He moved slowly. He crouched down, making himself as small as a man his size could reasonably manage. He kept both hands visible and his voice lower than he had used it in years. "Hey, nobody's going to hurt you. My name's Wade. What's yours?" The girl blinked. A fresh tear rolled through the dirt on her cheek, finding the path left by the ones before it. "Nora," she said. "My name is Nora." He did not move for a long moment. He stayed there on one knee in the dry pine needle duff, approximately 3 feet from the girl, close enough to see the scratches on her forearms and the trembling in her lower lip with each slow breath, and the exact pale green of her eyes catching the filtered afternoon light coming through the canopy above them. He had no training for this. He had no script prepared. Every instinct he had built over 20 years told him to call someone and walk away from this, that it was not his problem and not his world and not his category of situation. He was a man who understood engines and roads and the clear established hierarchy of a motorcycle club. He was not a man equipped for a 7-year-old girl crying alone in a forest. But Nora's eyes held him in place in a way nothing else had managed to hold him in longer than he could accurately measure. They were pale green, almost gray in the filtered light, and they looked at him with a combination of fear and something else he could not immediately name. He named it after a moment. It was hope, desperate and unguarded, and completely directed at him and at Wade Callahan, who had spent 20 years being looked at with suspicion and distance and the careful wariness of people who had already decided what he was before he opened his mouth. No one had ever looked at him and hoped. "Nora," he said quietly, "how long have you been out here?" She shrugged. The motion was so small it barely registered. "Since yesterday? Maybe before yesterday. I don't know." "Are you hurt anywhere?" She shook her head, then paused and looked down at her feet and then back up at him. "My feet hurt," she said, as if admitting a weakness she felt she should have been managing better than she was. Wade unzipped the saddlebag he had carried down from the bike, a battered leather pouch that held a water bottle, a small wrench he carried by habit, and a pack of beef jerky that was there for no particular reason except that he sometimes got hungry on long afternoon rides and had stopped planning further ahead than that. He held out the water bottle first and said nothing, just held it out and waited. Nora stared at it for a moment with the particular stillness of someone deciding whether to trust, then reached with both hands and drank so fast that water ran down her chin and soaked the front of her dress. "Slow down," Wade said quietly. "You'll make yourself sick." She slowed. She gasped. She drank again more carefully, taking the water in controlled swallows. When she finished, she looked at him with an expression that opened something else in his chest, pure and completely unguarded gratitude, the kind that a 7-year-old has not yet learned to moderate or protect herself with. He gave her the jerky. She ate it in small, urgent bites, the way a creature eats when it expects the food to be taken back before it can be finished. "Where's your mom?" "Nora, where's your family?" The question changed her face immediately. The gratitude retreated and something older came forward to replace it. Something that arranged itself on her features with a practiced ease that no child her age should have developed this fluency in. Something that had been worn smooth through repetition. "Mama left," she said in a flat, even voice that carried no particular emotion because the emotion associated with this fact had been used up in some earlier accounting. "She said she was going to the store. She told me to wait inside. I waited a long time and then it got dark and I got scared and I went outside to look for her and I couldn't find the trailer again. I just kept walking and then I was in the trees and I couldn't get out." Wade's jaw tightened until he could feel it in his back teeth. He knew the shape of this story, not the specific version of it, but the architecture of it, the particular way certain kinds of abandonment arrange themselves into a narrative that children learn to tell with a flatness that was more devastating than any tears could be because the flatness meant the tears had already been used up long before this moment. He had lived inside that architecture himself as a boy. He had told similar stories with a similar flatness, because you learned early that the emotion did not help anything move forward, and the flatness at least let you get through the telling. He checked his phone, no signal, too deep in the trees, too far from any tower. "Okay, Nora, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to carry you to my motorcycle, and we're going to ride into town where there are people who can help you. Is that all right?" She hesitated. Her eyes moved to his vest and the patches and the worn leather, then came back to his face. She was calculating something with the slow, deliberate care of a child who had learned not to make decisions quickly, who had learned that the person you chose to trust was often the wrong choice. She was weighing the fear of him against the fear of being alone in these trees when dark came again. "You won't leave me?" she asked. The question hit Wade somewhere below the sternum, somewhere he had not expected to be hit. He had been left. He had left others. He had spent his entire adult life constructing himself carefully around the premise that he would never need anyone enough to be seriously damaged by their absence, and the few times that premise had failed him, the damage had been considerable, and he had not repeated the error. And now this girl, this tiny, barefoot, dirt-streaked, 7-year-old girl, was asking him for the one thing he had never successfully given to anyone or received from anyone in 44 years of living. "I won't leave you," he said. He meant it. He did not fully understand how he knew that he meant it, but he did with a certainty that bypassed every deliberating, risk-assessing part of his mind and settled somewhere deeper. Nora let him pick her up. She weighed almost nothing less than he had expected, even knowing how small she was. Her arms went around his neck and she pressed her face against his shoulder and held on with the grip of someone who has been holding on with everything they have for a very long time and is not prepared to let go of anything solid. Wade carried her through the manzanita and the fallen branches and the afternoon heat back through the tree line to the gravel road where his Harley waited in the sun with its chrome catching the light. He sat her in front of him on the seat, one arm wrapped around her, and rode back toward Reading at the slowest pace he had ever held on any road. The engine rumbled beneath them with its deep, familiar vibration, and Nora's grip on his forearm tightened every time they curved, but she did not cry. She watched the pine trees scroll past with the wide, alert eyes of a child who had spent enough time being afraid that fear had become a kind of permanent, full attention to the world, and who had not yet learned that anything else was possible. They reached the Shasta County Sheriff's Office. It was at 4:17 in the afternoon. Wade carried Nora inside and the room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when something unexpected has walked through the door and everyone present is in the process of deciding what to do about it. Deputy Frank Aldridge looked up from his desk and went very still. His hand moved toward his belt, not to his weapon, but close enough to communicate something about his level of alertness. "Callahan," he said, carefully, "what brings you in?" "Found this girl in the woods near Crystal Creek. She says her mother left her alone 2 days ago. She's been out there at least one night, maybe longer. She needs food, water, and someone who knows what they're doing with a situation like this." Aldridge looked at Nora, who looked back at him with those pale green eyes that were registering everything in the room. Then he looked at Wade. The suspicion did not leave his face entirely, but it made room for professionalism to operate alongside it. "Set her down here," Aldridge said, gesturing to a chair beside his desk. "I'll call social services." Wade placed Nora in the chair. Her hand caught his sleeve as he straightened up, both fingers closing around the leather with more strength than her size suggested she had. "Don't go," she said. Not crying, just clear and direct. Wade looked at Aldridge. The deputy lifted one shoulder in a minimal shrug that communicated this was Wade's call to make. Wade pulled a chair next to Nora and sat down. He did not fill the air with reassurance. He did not say anything at all. He just stayed. Diane Mercer arrived from Shasta County Social Services 40 minutes later. She was a woman in her mid-50s, tall and deliberate in every movement, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and a folder she carried with the easy authority of someone who had walked into difficult rooms for a very long time and knew how to occupy them. She had worked in this county for 23 years, and she had seen every category of child neglect that this place could produce, and her face carried the professional calm of someone who had learned early that you could not do this work sustainably if you let each case find the same nerve every time. She crouched in front of Nora and introduced herself in a voice that was warm, but not falsely bright, the voice of someone who respected children enough to speak to them directly. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm Diane. I'm here to help you figure out what happens next." Nora looked at Diane, then she looked at Wade. Her hand did not release his sleeve. Diane's eyes moved briefly to the vest and the patches and the scar running down Wade's jaw. Her expression registered something and then smoothed itself out deliberately. She had questions. She kept them where they were and got to work. Within an hour, she had the outline of the story. Paula Sloan, 33 years old, had left her daughter alone in a rented trailer on Buckeye Road approximately 2 days ago. The trailer was empty when a deputy checked it. Neighbors reported Paula had been using again. No one had reported the child missing because no one had known the child was there. Wade listened to all of it from his chair. His hands rested on his knees. They had gradually, over the course of that hour, formed fists tight enough that his knuckles had gone white at every joint. 3 days passed. Wade Callahan could not stop thinking about Nora Sloan. He went through the motions of his days with the mechanical persistence of a man following a routine that no longer had any purchase on him. Morning coffee at Rusty's, sitting at the same table hearing Roy talk about the same things Roy always talked about. Afternoon rides with the others on roads he had ridden so many times, his hands knew every curve without being asked. Evenings in the garage behind his house on Hilltop Drive, working on engines and the smell of oil and metal that had always been the closest approximation of peace he knew how to make. But underneath everything constant and insistent as a signal, he could not locate or switch off, was the memory of that small voice in the woods. I hid here all night. I was scared of everything. He told himself it was not his problem. The system existed for this. Social services foster care, the machinery built and staffed and funded specifically for children whose parents had failed them. He had done more than most people would have done. He had found her. He had stayed. He had brought her in. That was enough. It was not enough. On the fourth day, he rode to the social services office on Court Street. He parked his Harley between a county vehicle and a minivan and walked inside. The woman at the front desk registered everything about him in approximately 2 seconds, and her smile became something closer to a fortification. 2 minutes later, Diane Mercer appeared in the hallway. "Come with me," she said. They sat in a small office with fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency just below conscious awareness, in a window overlooking the parking lot. Diane folded her hands on the desk and did not hurry. "Why are you here, Mr. Callahan?" "I want to know how Nora is doing. I can't share case details with someone who isn't family or a legal guardian. You know that. I'm not asking for details. I'm asking if she's okay." Diane was quiet for a moment that was long enough to contain something. She looked at the folder on her desk and then back at him. "She's in temporary foster care," Diane said carefully. "She's safe. She's been asking about you." Wade went still. "About me? She calls you the man with the motorcycle. She asked the foster family every day whether you called. She asked me when I saw her this week whether you were coming back." The words settled into the center of his chest like stones dropped from a height into still water, and he felt the rings moving outward from that point, and he could not stop them. "Her mother," he said. "Did you find her?" "Paula Sloan was located in Anderson 2 days ago. She's facing charges of child abandonment and neglect. She won't be getting Nora back. Not anytime soon, if ever." "Does Nora have other family, anyone?" "We're still looking. No one has come forward." Wade nodded slowly. He stood and thanked her and moved toward the door. "Mr. Callahan?" Diane's voice came from behind him, quieter than the professional tone she had been using. He turned. She stood behind her desk with her hands at her sides, and she looked at him for a moment before she chose her words. "This is not the first time a report has been filed regarding Nora," she said. "There have been 3 previous reports in the past 18 months. A neighbor who heard things, a teacher at her school who documented bruising on 2 separate occasions, an emergency room visit for a burn on her forearm that was recorded as accidental, but that the attending physician noted was consistent with deliberate contact." She paused and let that settle. All 3 reports were investigated and closed within 48 hours of being received. The same name appears as the closing authority on all 3 forms: Craig Holden. He is the placement coordinator for this district. Wade looked at her. 48 hours. "I have worked in this building for 23 years, Diane said. "I have never seen a legitimate child abuse report closed in 48 hours. Not a single one. It takes longer than that to schedule the initial home assessment." She said nothing further. She had said what she needed to say, and she was a careful professional who understood precisely where the limits of her role were. Wade drove home and sat in his garage for 2 hours in the dark, not working on anything, just sitting with what he had been told. Then he called Roy. Roy listened without interrupting, which for him required a visible and audible effort. When Wade finished, Roy set his beer down on the workbench and was quiet for a moment. "So what are you going to do?" Roy asked. "I don't know." "That's a first. You always know." "Not this time." Roy leaned forward on the milk crate with his elbows on his knees and looked at Wade directly. "You want to help her. You've known that since you found her. The rest is just you looking for a reason not to do what you already know you're going to do. You've always done this. You know exactly what's right, and then you spend time looking for the escape route. It's not simple. The knowing isn't complicated, the doing is complicated. But the knowing is completely simple, and you've known since you picked her up in those woods." Roy picked up his beer. "She asked every day if you were coming back." "That's what Diane said." Roy was quiet for a moment. "So you go back," he said finally. "That's the whole answer." The next morning, Wade called Diane Mercer and asked what it would take to become a temporary foster parent. The silence on the line was long enough that he checked to make sure the call had not dropped. "Mr. Callahan," Diane said finally, measuring each word, "I appreciate what you did for Nora, genuinely, but the process involves a criminal background check, a mandatory home evaluation, a series of required training courses, and approval from the county board. Your affiliation is going to be a significant factor in every part of that process." I'm not asking you to skip any of it. I want to know what every step looks like so I can complete all of them. Another pause shorter with a different quality. Come to my office tomorrow morning at 9, Diane said. I'll walk you through the process. Wade hung up and sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. His heart was moving faster than it had in years. Not with adrenaline, not with anger. With something that felt dangerously close to hope. And he understood instinctively that hope was the kind of thing you had to handle carefully because it was exactly the thing that could take everything you had and leave you with nothing if it went badly. But it was there. He did not push it away. The news story ran 4 days later. Local evening broadcast headline factual, in tone carrying something underneath it. Comments online split roughly down the middle between people calling him decent and people raising questions about a man with his affiliations and record being anywhere near a child. Wade read the comments once and closed the laptop. Boyd Garrett called 2 days later. Boyd was the Reading chapter president, 56 years old, lean and watchful with a voice that never needed to rise and eyes that missed nothing. I heard you're looking into fostering a kid, Boyd said. That's right. You understand what that does to the club's visibility. I understand what it means for Nora if nobody steps up. Boyd studied him across the desk. You're going to bring attention. Media, county workers, people looking for angles. That's not good for how things operate. This isn't about how things operate, Wade said. Not for me, not right now. He walked out of the clubhouse and felt the door close behind him. He walked to his bike and sat on it in the afternoon heat and felt the weight of what that door closing meant. 20 years of riding with those men. He had bled with some of them. He had covered for others in ways that cost him. Walking out without looking back was not a small thing. But he started his engine and he rode home. The foster care application process moved with the grinding patience of a system designed for caution. The background check flagged 2 misdemeanor arrests from his 20s, a bar fight in Sacramento, and a trespassing charge near Eureka, neither a disqualifier. 3 mandatory training sessions at the county building. Wade sat in plastic chairs in fluorescent light alongside married couples and a retired teacher and a hospital nurse, and all of them looking at him with varying degrees of uncertainty he registered and chose not to address. He submitted to the home inspection. He spent 2 full days cleaning the house on Hilltop Drive until everything reflected correctly, and the spare bedroom, which had been holding stored boxes and old gear and engine parts he had been meaning to sort for 2 years, held a new bed frame, a dresser from the thrift store on Market Street, and a lamp he had spent 6 minutes choosing between 2 options. He chose the one with butterflies on the shade. The cashier at the thrift store, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair, and the observational patience of someone who has been watching people for a long time, looked at Wade and then at the butterfly lamp and started to say something, and then decided not to. Diane conducted the home visit herself. She moved through each room with her clipboard and checked everything she needed to check and asked questions about his schedule and his income from the machine shop on Hartnell Avenue, where he worked 3 days a week, and his support network and his ongoing relationship with the Hells Angels chapter. He answered every question honestly and without attempting to frame anything in a more favorable light than the reality actually warranted. When she reached the spare bedroom and stood in the doorway looking at the bed and the dresser and the butterfly lamp that was already on, because Wade had turned it on that morning, when he opened the room and had not turned it off, she asked the question she had been building toward since she arrived. Why do you want to do this, Mr. Callahan? Wade leaned against the door frame across the narrow hall. He looked at the room for a moment, at the butterfly lamp and the empty dresser and the bed with its new sheets. The room was small and plain and completely ready. Because somebody should have done it for me, he said, and nobody did. Diane wrote something on her clipboard. She looked up at him, and this time there was something alongside the professional calm, something that had been accumulating across every interaction they had had since the sheriff's office. The county board meets next Thursday, she said. I'll submit my recommendation before then. What will you recommend? She paused in the front doorway. For the first time since they had met, she offered him a smile that was small and careful but entirely genuine with nothing else underneath it. Approval, she said. Provisional with regular check-ins, but approval. That evening, Wade sat in the garage long after Roy went home. The butterfly lamp was in the spare bedroom where it belonged. Outside, the heat had finally softened into something that felt like the memory of a cooler day, and the smell of the pine hills came down through the open garage door and mixed with the smell of oil and iron and warm metal that was his version of home. He sat on the milk crate with a beer going warm in his hand and thought about a little girl asking every single day whether the man with the motorcycle was coming back. Then his phone rang, past 10 o'clock, a number he did not recognize. He answered, "Mr. Callahan." The voice was male, older, deliberate, and unhurried, the voice of someone accustomed to choosing words with care. "My name is Art Decker. I used to ride with the Sacramento chapter maybe 15 years ago. I don't know if you'd remember the name." "I remember," Wade said. "You left, went into government work. Financial investigations, FBI for 12 years, then private sector for 8, now retired. Living outside Reading 3 years now." A pause that was considered rather than uncertain. "I heard what you're doing for that girl. Roy mentioned it when I ran into him. I did some looking after that conversation." Wade went still. "What kind of looking?" "The kind I spent 20 years learning to do. Craig Holden, the man who closed those 3 abuse reports. I pulled his financial disclosure records and cross-referenced them with public filings in Nevada and California." A pause. "There are 3 wire transfers over the past 18 months. The originating account belongs to a holding company registered in Nevada. That holding company shares its registered agent with the law firm that has represented Paula Sloan in every legal matter she has had in this county going back 6 years. The receiving account is personal. It belongs to Craig Holden. 2. The garage was very quiet. Down the block, a dog barked twice and went silent. "How much total?" Wade asked. $14,000, 3 transfers. Each one arrived within 7 days of one of the 3 report closures." Wade set his beer down carefully on the floor beside the milk crate. "Art," he said, "why are you telling me this?" "Because you are doing the right thing for that girl," Art said simply, "and someone with a position of authority is working to prevent it. I thought you should know exactly what you are up against. Can you prove it through channels that would hold up? If you give me time to build the evidentiary chain correctly and get it to the county oversight committee in a form that survives legal scrutiny. The problem is that doing it correctly takes time. Your hearing is Thursday morning." "Then what do I do on Thursday?" "Thursday you show up," Art said. "You tell the truth you have. You let that truth be the only thing in the room that you are responsible for. I will handle the rest from my end, but I need you to trust me on the timing." Wade looked down the hallway at the light from the butterfly lamp reaching into the hall from the spare bedroom. "Yeah," he said, "I trust you on the timing." He did not sleep much that night. 3 days before the hearing, Craig Holden filed a formal written objection to Wade's application with the county board. The objection cited criminal history, active Hells Angels membership, and what it described as inherent instability of an environment where a child would be exposed to outlaw motorcycle club culture. Holden requested a 30-day postponement for additional psychological and environmental evaluation. The board chair granted the postponement that same afternoon without calling a formal review session. Diane called Wade with the news. Her professional voice was intact. Beneath it was something unmistakably different from professional neutrality. "You can request supervised visits," she told him. 2 hours on Saturday mornings. The Prescotts have agreed." "Who are the Prescotts?" "The temporary foster family. Nora is safe there. The environment is stable and appropriate." Diane paused. "She doesn't engage much. She eats and she sleeps and she attends school, but she is very quiet in a way she was not in our initial meeting." Wade spent the week working at the machine shop and riding in the evenings and sitting in the garage with Roy after dinner without talking very much. He called Diane once to ask if there was anything additional he could provide for the file, and she said no, and that the most useful thing he could do was continue to appear consistently. On Saturday morning, he drove to the Prescott house on Yuba Street. Clean beige ranch house, trimmed lawn minivan in the driveway. He brought a bag with juice boxes, an apple slice, and a picture book he had found at the drugstore. Betty Prescott opened the door, looked at him carefully, and stepped back to let him in. Nora appeared at the end of the hallway before Betty could call for her. She walked fast, not quite running, moving with the contained urgency of someone who has been waiting and is not willing to waste a second now that the waiting is over. She covered the length of the hallway and put both arms around Wade's waist and pressed her face into his shirt and held on. Wade put one hand gently on the back of her head. "Hey, kid," he said. "Hey," she said into his shirt, muffled and certain. They sat in the Prescott living room for 2 hours. Nora showed him a drawing she had made during the week, a house with a large tree beside it and 2 figures in front. One small, one large. The large one had a dark rectangle on its back. Wade looked at it for a long time and did not say anything because there was nothing he could say that would come close to what it deserved. They read the picture book. They played cards. Nora won 3 games in a row with a calm, focused attention that went considerably beyond what the rules technically required. When it was time to leave, Nora walked with Wade to the front door. She stood on the threshold and looked up at him with both hands clasped in front of her, entirely serious. "Are you still trying?" she asked. "Every single day," Wade said, "not stopping." She nodded once satisfied, as if this confirmed something she had already decided about him. Then she went back inside. Wade sat in his truck in the Prescott's driveway for a few minutes. Then he drove home and called Roy. "I need you to make some calls," he said. "What kind of calls?" "The kind you make when something actually matters. Sacramento, Oakland, Fresno, Bakersfield, wherever people will pick up." "What do I tell them?" Wade looked out the windshield at the Reading sky going pale gold toward evening. "Tell them the truth," he said. "Tell them about Nora. Tell them what I'm trying to do. Tell them I could use some company Thursday morning." What Roy Briggs said to riders from 7 chapters spread across 400 miles of California was not organized into an argument. He said it the way he always said things that mattered, directly and without preparation. He told them about a 7-year-old girl left in the woods. He told them about 3 abuse reports closed in 48 hours each by the same man with the same pen. He told them about a brother of theirs who had found her and had been showing up for her every single day since, without anyone asking him to, and without stopping when they made it difficult. Then he asked one question. "We spend our whole lives being told what we are by people who decided before they ever looked at us. Every cop who pulls us over. Every judge who sees the patch before he sees the man. Every stranger who steps off the sidewalk when he hears us coming. Maybe some of that is something we earn. Maybe there are things behind us that we are not proud of. But right now there is a little girl who was left in the woods, and one of our brothers is the only person who stepped up. So I am asking you, are we going to be who they say we are, or are we going to be who we know we are?" Within 48 hours, 63 riders had confirmed they would be in Reading on Thursday morning. The night before the hearing, Wade sat alone in his garage. He was not working on anything. He sat on the milk crate with the overhead light on and looked at his vest hanging on the hook by the door. The patches and the insignia and the leather that had been present at every important event in his adult life, and some events that should have been important and hadn't been. He thought about his father. He thought about walking out the back door at 15 in the middle of the night and not looking back. He thought about all the roads since then, all the early mornings on highways. He didn't know all the places that were exactly alike once you had been in enough of them. He thought about what all that motion had let him avoid feeling. He thought about Nora's drawing, the large figure with the dark rectangle on its back. He thought about Craig Holden and $14,000 and 3 reports closed in 48 hours each, and about a little girl with a burn on her arm that had been documented as accidental by people who had been given a reason to call it accidental. He sat in the garage until well past midnight. When he went inside, he laid out his clothes for the morning. Clean jeans, a blue button-down shirt with a collar that he had owned for 3 years and worn approximately twice. Clean boots. He walked back to the garage doorway and stood looking at the vest on the hook. He left it there. He drove to the courthouse at 8:15. The sky above Reading was pale blue and clear from the mountains to the valley floor, and the heat was already establishing itself at that early hour. The streets near the courthouse were quiet. Then the sound started. It began as something felt before it was heard, a deep resonance in the pavement, and in the air simultaneously the particular frequency of many large engines arriving from multiple directions and converging. It grew until it filled the entire width of the valley, a wall of sound that vibrated in the courthouse windows and in the chests of everyone within 3 blocks. 63 motorcycles came down Market Street and the surrounding streets in a formation that took 2 full blocks to contain. They came from Sacramento and Oakland and Fresno and Bakersfield and chapters in between. Some wore their patches, some wore plain clothes. All of them arrived and parked and got off their bikes and stood in the July heat without blocking traffic or making threats or doing anything except being present in numbers that could not be ignored or explained away. Local television news vans appeared within 15 minutes. Cameras swept across the crowd and back to the man standing on the courthouse steps in a button-down shirt without a vest. Roy rode at the front. He pulled to the curb in front of the courthouse and killed his engine, and looked up at Wade on the steps with an expression that did not need words to carry everything it held. Wade looked back at him for a moment. Then he turned and walked inside. The hearing room held a long table at the front where 5 board members sat with their files and their water glasses and the carefully neutral faces of people who make decisions for a living. A court reporter was positioned to one side. Craig Holden sat in the back row in a gray suit, his hands folded precisely on one knee, his expression arranged with the practiced blankness of a man who had been in official rooms long enough to know exactly how to occupy them without revealing anything. Paula Sloan sat across the room with her attorney, Fletcher, a trim, efficient man who moved his papers with practiced economy. Paula wore a neat jacket and held her hands still in her lap with the particular effort of someone working at stillness rather than resting in it. Diane Mercer presented first. She moved through Wade's application methodically. The background check results, the training completion documentation, the home evaluation findings, the 14 supervised visits and the observable changes in Nora's behavior across those weeks, the nightmares less frequent, the appetite normalizing, the wariness with adults gradually softening into something that might, with time and consistency, become trust. Then she set down her clipboard and looked at the 5 board members directly and said something that was not part of her written report. "I have worked in this county for 23 years, she said. And in that time, I have learned that the best predictor of a good parent is not background, not income, not appearance, not the absence of any particular history. It is the consistent willingness to show up for a child who has been taught by her own experience that no one will. Mr. Callahan has shown up. At every step of this process, through every obstacle placed in front of him, he has shown up." Holden shifted very slightly in his seat. Paula's attorney presented his case: the 30 days of clean testing, the treatment facility documentation, the irreplaceable nature of the biological maternal bond, the absence of any family connection between Wade Callahan and Nora Sloan, the documented history of outlaw motorcycle club affiliation. Board member Patricia Aldrich, a retired school principal with silver hair and the careful attention of someone who had spent decades distinguishing between what people said and what they actually meant, leaned forward. "Mr. Callahan, there are 63 motorcyclists outside this building. Can you explain that?" Wade looked at her without performing anything. "They're my family," he said. "They came because they believe people deserve second chances. Nora does, I do. That's all I know how to say." The board members conferred quietly. Then Diane Mercer placed a document on the table. She set it down without ceremony. 5 pages paper-clipped at the top left corner. She addressed the board chair. "I would like to enter an additional document into the record. This is a comparative analysis of 3 previous reports filed regarding Nora Sloan over the past 18 months. Each report came from a separate source. Each involved a separate incident. Each was investigated and closed within 48 hours of being received." She did not raise her voice. "The same name appears as the closing authority on all 3 forms." She did not say the name. She stepped back. The board chair picked up the document. The other 4 members leaned toward him. The room went completely quiet. At that moment, in the Safeway parking lot across the street, Art Decker sat in a folding lawn chair with a laptop open on his knees and transmitted a complete file to the Shasta County Oversight Committee, copied simultaneously to the Sacramento Bee correspondent standing in front of the courthouse, and to the county district attorney's office. The file contained 3 wire transfer records with complete account documentation, the Nevada registered agent filings linking the holding company to Paula Sloan's law firm, and a precisely constructed timeline matching each transfer to the corresponding report closure within a 7-day window. He had spent 72 hours building the evidentiary chain in a way that would hold under every form of scrutiny it was about to face. A county employee appeared in the hearing room doorway and spoke quietly to Craig Holden. Holden smoothed his jacket with both hands and walked out of the room. He did not return. The board voted 4-1 in favor of provisional foster placement for Wade Callahan. Paula Sloan's petition for reunification was denied pending a complete investigation of all prior case closures connected to her file. Wade sat for a moment after the vote was announced. He placed both hands flat on the table and felt the grain of the wood under his palms and breathed once slowly. Then he stood up and walked out into the morning. The 63 riders were still standing in the heat when he came through the courthouse doors. They stretched along Market Street and into the side streets in the Safeway lot, and every one of them was looking at the courthouse steps. Wade stopped on the top step. The silence that fell over the crowd in the moment before Roy raised his fist was the loudest silence Wade had ever stood inside. Roy raised his fist. The sound that came up from 63 men was not the sound of a crowd performing something for cameras. It was the raw, deep sound of people who meant it, coming from the chest rather than the throat, and it hit the courthouse facade and rolled out down Market Street and across the Sacramento River and up into the Pine Hills to the north and kept going. Wade stood on the top step in his button-down shirt without his vest and let the sound move over him and did not perform anything for the cameras. He just stood there with tears running freely into his gray-streaked beard, and for the first time in his adult life, he did not try to hide them or redirect them or make them into something they were not. Roy walked up the steps and stood beside him. He did not say anything. He just stood there the way you stand next to someone you have known long enough to understand that some moments need a witness and nothing else. The first night Nora spent in the house on Hilltop Drive, she did not sleep. Wade knew because he did not sleep either. He sat in the living room with the butterfly lamp on its lowest setting, its warm light making a soft pool across the floor, and listened to the sounds from the spare bedroom. The creak of the new bed frame as she shifted position, the rustle of sheets, the quiet sound of bare feet on the hardwood floor as she crossed the room, opened the door just wide enough to confirm that the lamp was on and Wade was there, and went back to bed. She did this 4 times between 10 o'clock and midnight. The 5th time at 12:30 in the morning, she opened the door and did not go back. She walked into the living room in the oversized purple t-shirt with the faded cartoon cat that Diane had brought from the county donation supply, and she stood in the middle of the room with her arms at her sides and looked at Wade with her pale green eyes. "I can't sleep," she said. "Me neither," Wade said. "Are you scared?" He thought about the comfortable answer. He had been giving himself and other people comfortable answers for most of his life, and he was tired of the texture of them. "Yeah," he said, "a little." "Of what?" "Of not being good enough at this." Nora considered this with the full gravity of someone taking a question seriously. Then she walked to the couch and climbed up and sat beside him. Not touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, small and steady. "You found me," she said simply. "That's good enough." They sat together in the lamplight while Redding was quiet around them, and the Pine Hills held the dark outside the windows. After a while, Nora's head tilted sideways and came to rest against Wade's arm. Her breathing slowed and deepened. Her eyes closed. Wade Callahan sat completely still and did not move and did not speak and let her sleep against his arm, and he sat with it. The weeks that followed were a landscape Wade had no map for and was learning one turn at a time. He learned how to make breakfast that a 7-year-old would eat without complaint. Scrambled eggs with no pepper because Nora was particular about pepper. Toast with strawberry jam spread all the way to the edges without exception. Apple slices arranged in a fan on the plate because Nora said they tasted better that way, and he had tested this hypothesis himself one morning and concluded she was correct. He learned the bedtime sequence that had to happen in the same order every night to work. Teeth brushed, face washed, one chapter read, in a voice that was calm and consistent and didn't drop to monotone because monotone put her to sleep before the chapter ended, and she did not like waking up, not knowing how things had turned out. Butterfly lamp turned to its lowest setting, door left open exactly 1 hand's width. He learned that thunderstorms required him to be visibly present without making a production of it, just somewhere in her line of sight until the storm passed. He learned that raised voices, even from television in another room, required a period of quiet afterward before things settled back to normal. He learned that she startled at sudden sounds in a way that needed patience afterward rather than reassurance patience, and the reliable fact of him still being in the room. He adjusted everything accordingly. He lowered the volume on his entire world. He moved through rooms with a gentleness that would have been completely unrecognizable to anyone who had known him a year earlier. Roy came twice a week with groceries and the easy, uncomplicated warmth that Nora responded to from the beginning. He taught her Go Fish Then Crazy Eights, then a simplified version of poker with M&Ms for chips. Nora won more often than probability could explain, and Roy accused her of cheating with theatrical outrage that made her laugh a clear, sudden sound that the first time Wade heard it stopped him completely in whatever he was doing, and he stood still and listened until it was done. Diane conducted her check-ins every 2 weeks and noted the improvements in the careful, measured language of official documentation. In her personal notes, which were not official records, she wrote things that did not belong in official documentation about a man learning to be something he had never been shown how to be, and doing it through pure attention and willingness and the particular stubbornness of someone who had simply decided that nothing was going to make him stop. Martha Pennington from 3 houses down knocked on Wade's door in late August with oatmeal cookies in a tin and no preamble. She had taught 4th grade for 31 years and had spent most of that time assessing children and the adults responsible for them. She handed him the tin and said these were for both of them and that she would bring more on Sundays. She did every Sunday from then on with the consistency of a person who has made a decision and does not require further discussion about it. Nora began watching for her from the front window on Sunday mornings and would announce her arrival before she knocked. The investigation into Craig Holden moved forward on its own track. He resigned from his position as placement coordinator within the week after the hearing, citing personal reasons. The investigation opened by the County Oversight Committee based on Art Decker's transmitted package would take several months. The charges when they came were for official corruption and willful dereliction of duty. The connection between his bank account and Paula Sloan's legal representation was laid out in a court proceeding that produced consequences for both parties. Paula Sloan's petition for reunification was formally dismissed in November. Art Decker came by Wade's garage on a Tuesday evening in late September. He was lean and deliberate and had the quiet of someone who had spent decades in rooms where information was everything. They sat on the milk crates with cold beers and did not talk much for a while, which was the right choice for both of them. The chain holds, Art said eventually. Every link. The DA's office is moving in the right direction. Good, Wade said. Holden is going to try to distribute the blame. It won't work. The timeline is too precise. Art turned his beer in his hand. Nora is not going back to her mother. The new caseworker on the file is someone I know personally. She is careful and she does the work correctly. They sat until the heat finally left the evening and the air from the Pine Hills carried the first real suggestion of fall. Art, Wade said, why did you actually do this? Art was quiet for a moment. I had a daughter, he said. She died when she was 9 years old, a very long time ago, before I knew how to be in the world properly around something like that. He took a drink. I've spent a lot of years since then doing things I told myself were for other reasons. This one I wanted to do for the actual reason. They sat in the garage until it was fully dark outside and the night insects were going in the grass, and the pine smell came down from the hills, and the overhead light buzzed faintly, and it was enough to sit in without needing to say anything else. Boyd Garrett called in late September. The conversation was brief and direct. I was wrong about this, Boyd said, about what it meant for the club. I know, Wade said. The club's behind you. Full chapter vote. I appreciate it. A pause. Then Boyd said something that Wade would carry for the rest of his life. You didn't leave us Callahan. You just showed us something we'd forgotten we could be. Wade held the phone for a moment after the call ended. Then he walked down the hall and looked in on Nora, who had been asleep for an hour. She was sleeping on her side now. She had started every night on her back with her arms straight at her sides, the position of someone who expected to need to be ready, and had gradually across the weeks shifted to the position of someone who was not expecting anything tonight that required readiness. Wade stood into the doorway with the butterfly lamp making its soft light across the room and looked at her for a moment. Then he went back to the kitchen and began filling out the formal adoption application that Diane had left on his table 3 days ago. He was careful. He read each question twice before answering it, and he answered every one honestly without attempting to present anything in a more favorable light than reality warranted. In early October, on a Saturday morning, when the Reading heat had finally admitted that summer was over and the first cool air from the mountains was arriving in the mornings, Wade put Nora in the front seat of his truck, and drove north on Route 299. The pines on both sides of the road were showing the first dryness of the seasonal change. The sky was pale blue and wide. The morning air through the open window carried something cleaner and cooler than anything the summer had offered, and the road ran straight through it north into the mountains the way it always had. Nora watched the road with the alert eyes she would always have, the ones that noticed everything, which Wade had come to understand was not only what she had survived, but also simply who she was. A girl who paid attention because the world was interesting to her, and because she had learned early that noticing things was how you stayed safe, and who was now in the slow process of learning that it could also just be how you understood things that did not require being safe from them. When they passed the turnoff near Crystal Creek, she was quiet for a moment. "Is that where you found me?" she asked. "Yeah," Wade said, "right there." She looked at the dirt path and the weathered gray picnic tables and the tree line where the manzanita grew thick in the shadows, and the old valley oaks stood back in the dimness. They drove on. A mile passed in the sound of the engine and the open window and the morning. "I'm glad you stopped," Nora said. Wade looked at her. She was sitting straight now, her feet flat on the floor mat in the pink sneakers with white laces she had chosen herself and wore every day. Her dark brown hair was in the ponytail that had taken him 2 weeks and many viewings of the same video tutorial at 2 in the morning to learn to do correctly. Her pale green eyes were on the road ahead, clear and steady, and completely present, taking in the mountains in the morning the way she took in everything. On the back of her right hand, a small, faint scar from one of the scratches on the day he found her was barely visible, now fading toward nothing. "Me too, kid," Wade said. "Me too." They drove on into the mountains and into the October morning, and into the year that was tilting toward fall, the colors in the hills just beginning to shift the air, carrying a clarity that the long heat of summer had not allowed. Behind them, the woods stood still at the edge of the road. Ahead, the road ran north through the pines, straight and wide open. Roy was at the house when they got back. He had let himself in with the key Wade gave him in August and was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and a 3-day-old newspaper, reading it with the full attention of a man who believes the news deserves attention, regardless of how old it is. He looked up when Nora came in. She went to the refrigerator and got an apple with the ease of someone who knew exactly what was there and that it would be there whenever she wanted it. She sat at the table across from Roy and cut the apple into slices with the small fruit knife Wade had bought for this purpose and arranged them in a fan on the plate. Roy looked at Wade over the top of the newspaper. Wade looked back at him. Roy's expression contained everything that had accumulated since the night in the garage when Wade had said he didn't know what he was going to do, and Roy had told him that the complicated part was always him. Roy folded the newspaper and set it down. "Cards," he said to Nora. "I'll get the M&Ms, she said and slid off her chair. Roy looked at Wade again. Wade pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. Outside the kitchen window, the Reading sky was clear and pale, and the cool October air came through the open window above the sink, carrying the smell of the pine hills and a faint thread of wood smoke from somewhere down the block. The sound of Nora finding the M&Ms in the cabinet and carrying them back to the table and climbing back into her chair filled the kitchen in the plain, unremarkable way of things that belong exactly where they are. Diane Mercer came by that afternoon with papers for the adoption file. She sat at the kitchen table with her clipboard and her glasses and went through each document carefully while Nora drew with colored pencils at the other end of the table, the set Martha Pennington had brought the previous Sunday. At some point, Diane stopped talking and looked across the table at the girl drawing in focused concentration, and then at the man beside her reading the next page in the adoption file with the patient attention of someone who has decided that whatever this process requires, he will provide all of it. She took her glasses off and set them on the table. "Mr. Callahan," she said. Wade looked up. Diane Mercer, who had maintained professional distance for 23 years, because it was the only way to continue doing the work, looked at him without any of the careful neutrality she had carried since the day he first walked into her office. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up." Wade looked at Nora at the other end of the table, absorbed in whatever she was drawing, the colored pencil moving in careful, deliberate strokes across the paper. The butterfly lamp was on in the hallway behind her, its warm light reaching into the kitchen in a long, soft rectangle across the floor. "She makes it easy," Wade said. The adoption process moved forward with the slowness appropriate to something this permanent. Every form completed, every appointment kept, every question from the new caseworker Hannah answered, with the same honesty that had been present in every part of this process from the beginning. Roy drove up one afternoon in November with a truck bed full of lumber and spent the weekend building a bookshelf for Nora's room that was considerably taller than her current collection of books required. "You'll grow into it," he told her. Nora examined it with the critical eye she brought to anything that was going to live in her room. "It needs paint," she said. "What color?" She thought about it for a moment. "Green," she said, "the kind of green that's almost blue." That Saturday, the three of them painted the bookshelf the color of a clear sky, just before the first stars appear, which was the color Nora had been thinking of all along. They stood in her room with small paint rollers and covered it carefully, and Roy got paint on his sleeve and declared it an improvement, and Nora laughed at him with the clear, easy laugh that still stopped Wade in his tracks, sometimes when he heard it. Martha Pennington came by the following Sunday with the cookies and stood in the doorway looking at the bookshelf. "That is exactly the right color," she said. In December, 3 weeks before Christmas, the county board approved the formal adoption petition. Diane called at 7 in the morning. Wade was at the stove making scrambled eggs. He looked at the number and stood still with the spatula in his hand before he answered. Diane said what she had to say clearly and without preamble, and with something in her voice that 23 years of professional distance could not completely contain. Wade set the spatula down on the counter. He stood at the stove and looked out the kitchen window at the December morning gray and cold and clean, the hills to the north showing their winter colors. He heard Nora's door open down the hall. She appeared in the kitchen in her pajamas with her hair loose and her green eyes slightly squinting in the kitchen light. She looked at Wade standing at the stove with the phone in his hand, and she knew immediately that something had happened because she always knew, because that was who she was. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing's wrong," Wade said. He set the phone on the counter. He crouched down to her level the way he had learned to do so the world looked the same size to both of them. "The board said yes," he said. "You're staying. It's official now. You're staying." Nora looked at him. Her face moved through something quickly, a flicker of something he could not entirely follow, and then settled into a stillness that was completely certain. "I know," she said. Wade looked at her. "I knew you were going to keep trying," she said. "You said every single day, so I knew." He looked at his daughter, who was 7 years old and had survived things a 7-year-old should not have to survive, and who had looked at a stranger in the woods and decided with the clear, direct judgment of a child who had learned not to waste trust that he was the safe thing in her world, and who had turned out to be entirely right about that in a way that neither of them had fully understood at the time. "Yeah," Wade said, "every single day. That was always the deal." Nora put her arms around his neck the way she had in the forest on the afternoon he carried her out of it, and Wade stayed completely still, with one hand on the back of her head, and let the December morning be exactly what it was. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was gray and clean and cold. Down the street, Martha Pennington was walking her dog in her blue coat. 3 houses away, a car started and backed out of a driveway and drove off down the street. Somewhere north of town on the highway, a motorcycle ran through its gears, heading into the mountains, and the sound of it came through the cold, clear December air and reached the kitchen window and passed on. Roy arrived at 10 o'clock with 2 bags of groceries and a box of donuts. He let himself in through the kitchen door the way he had since August, because this was a house he was welcome in, and everyone present had long since stopped needing that stated explicitly. He set the groceries on the counter and looked at Wade and looked at Nora and looked at the two of them together in the kitchen, with the scrambled eggs still on the stove and the butterfly lamp visible in the hallway, and the bookshelf painted the color of an almost blue sky visible at the end of the hall beyond that. Roy Briggs, who had ridden beside Wade for 20 years on every road California offered, and who had never once in all that time failed to tell the truth when it mattered, looked at all of it and did not say anything at all. He opened the box of donuts and set it in the middle of the table. "Who wants to lose at cards?" he said. The December morning came fully through the kitchen window above the sink, pale and clear and cold, carrying the smell of the pine hills and the particular clean smell of a day that has not yet been used. The 3 of them sat down at the kitchen table together, the girl and the man who had found her, and the man who had told him to go back and keep trying, and they were exactly what they were, which was enough, which was considerably more than enough, which was everything that any of them had needed, and none of them had known how to ask for until the day it simply arrived in the form of a child sitting alone at the base of an oak tree in the forest, with her knees pulled up and her eyes full of hope aimed at exactly the right place. After the hearing, after Roy and the crowd and the courthouse steps and the tears, he did not hide. Wade drove to the Prescott house and picked up Nora himself. Karen Whitfield rode with them from social services to sign the necessary transfer documentation. Nora came out the front door of the Prescott house carrying a small backpack, the only thing that had been truly hers in that house, and she walked to Wade's truck without looking back. Betty Prescott stood in the doorway and watched. Her expression was not unkind. It was the expression of someone who had done what was asked of them and was now watching the outcome from a respectful distance. She raised her hand once as the truck pulled away. Nora saw it and raised hers in return through the back window. Wade watched this in the rearview mirror and said nothing. The drive from the Prescott house to Hilltop Drive took 11 minutes. Nora sat in the passenger seat with her backpack on her lap and watched the streets of Reading past the window with the careful attention she brought to everything. She had been in Wade's truck once before, briefly, the day he drove her to the supervised visit. But this was different, and she knew it was different, and she did not pretend otherwise. "This is your street?" she asked when he turned onto Hilltop Drive. "Yeah, our street now." She looked at the houses, the ordinary parade of them, the trim lawns and the parked cars, and the Saturday afternoon quiet of a residential block in a mid-sized California city in July. 3 houses down, she could see the tidy front porch of Martha Pennington's house. The Sunday cookies had not started yet. That was still a month away. Wade pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. They sat for a moment. "Do you want to go in?" he asked. "Yes," Nora said. "Then can I see my room?" "It's your room. You can see it whenever you want." She climbed out of the truck with her backpack over one shoulder and walked to the front door and waited for him to unlock it. Inside, the house smelled like the house, like the particular combination of motor oil on hands that had been washed but not entirely cleaned, and coffee, and the mild smell of old wood, and the clean smell of the sheets in the spare bedroom that Wade had washed 3 times in the week before, because he was not sure how many times was the right number and had landed on 3. Nora walked through the living room and down the hallway without asking where it was. She had been here once for the home inspection, and she had a precise memory. She stopped in the doorway of the spare bedroom and looked at it for a long moment. The butterfly lamp was on. Wade had turned it on before he left to pick her up an hour before he needed to leave, because he had wanted it on when she arrived. Nora stepped into the room and set her backpack on the bed and looked around at the walls, at the empty dresser, at the closet door standing open with its empty rod visible inside. She turned slowly, taking the measure of the space the way someone takes the measure of something they are going to have to learn to inhabit. Then she looked at Wade in the doorway. "It's good," she said, not enthusiastically, carefully, as if she was making an assessment that mattered and wanted to get it right. "We can change anything you don't like," Wade said. "Paint furniture, whatever. It doesn't have to stay like this." She thought about this. "I want to paint the walls," she said. "Okay, what color?" She thought about it again the same way she thought about everything, with full attention and no rush. "Not white," she said. "White makes rooms feel empty." "What color then?" "I don't know yet. I need to think about it." "Take all the time you need," Wade said. She turned back to look at the butterfly lamp and was quiet for a moment. "I like the lamp," she said. "Good, I wasn't sure about the butterflies." "Butterflies are good," she said with a finality that closed the subject. She unzipped her backpack and began taking things out and arranging them on the dresser with the systematic focus of someone who has strong opinions about where things belong. A small stuffed bear that was worn almost smooth, clearly old, and clearly important. A library book that she had apparently borrowed and not yet returned and had been carrying with her through the foster placement. A photograph, small edges bent, which she set on the dresser without looking at it and then turned away from. Wade did not ask about the photograph. "Are you hungry?" he said. "A little. I was going to make grilled cheese. Is that okay?" She looked at him. "With tomato." "I can do tomato." "On the side," she said. "Not in the sandwich. Tomato and grilled cheese makes it soggy." Wade stood in the doorway looking at this 7-year-old girl who had arrived in his house with a worn stuffed bear and very specific opinions about grilled cheese, and felt something in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. Something that was not sentiment and not gratitude and not the hollow longing that had been sitting in him for years. Something more like a rival. "Tomato on the side," he said. "Got it." Dinner that first night was quiet in a good way. They sat at the kitchen table with the grilled cheese sandwiches and the tomato slices on the side and glasses of apple juice, because that was what Wade had in the refrigerator. Nora ate with the measured pace of someone who was being careful not to finish too fast, which Wade understood had its own history and which he said nothing about. He simply refilled her juice when it was low and put more tomato slices on the plate without being asked. After dinner, they did the dishes together, or rather, Wade washed and Nora dried with a dish towel that was slightly too big for her, and they did it in a comfortable quiet that was a different kind of quiet from the silences Wade had been living in for years. This one had someone in it. At 7 o'clock, Nora announced she wanted to take a bath. Wade showed her where the towels were and where the shampoo was, and confirmed that she could manage on her own, which she could, and which she wanted him to know she could. He sat in the living room and listened to the water run and the small sounds of someone moving around in the bathroom and felt the house settle into something it had not been before. She came out 40 minutes later in her pajamas with her hair damp, smelling of the children's shampoo that he had bought specifically and somewhat hopefully 2 weeks earlier. What's next, she asked. Teeth, then book, then sleep, Wade said. What book? You pick. Your backpack had a library book. She considered this. I'm on chapter 4, she said. You'd need to start from the beginning to understand what's happening. Then you tell me what happened in the first 3 chapters, and we start from 4. She thought about whether this was an acceptable methodology for entering a story midway. She decided it was. They sat on the couch and she summarized chapters 1 through 3 of a book about a girl who discovers that the old lighthouse on the edge of her town is not actually abandoned. It is the home of a family of seals who can become human on certain nights of the year. She summarized it with the precision of someone who had read those chapters carefully and retained them completely, and wanted him to understand the story well enough to appreciate chapter 4 properly. Wade listened to every word. Then she read chapter 4 aloud to him, slowly stopping to explain anything she thought he might have missed, even with the summary, occasionally looking up to check that he was following. He was following. He was following completely. At the end of chapter 4, which ended on a moderately suspenseful note, involving the lighthouse keeper's granddaughter and a question about whether one of the seals had left something important in the wrong place, Nora closed the book and held it in her lap. We'll read more tomorrow, she said. Every night, Wade said. She nodded. This was acceptable. He walked her to her room and she did the sequence. Teeth face lights down to the lowest setting on the butterfly lamp door open one hand's width. She lay down in the new bed in her pajamas and pulled the covers up to her chin and looked at the ceiling. Wade, she said. Yeah. Thank you for the butterfly lamp. He stood in the doorway with the dim light behind him. You're welcome. Good night. Good night, Nora. He went back to the living room and sat down and listened to the small sounds from her room settle into the deeper quiet of a child genuinely trying to sleep. He sat with it. He sat with all of it. That was how it started. That was the first day of what would become the life they made together in that house on Hilltop Drive in Redding, California, in the summer that turned into fall and then into winter. In the weeks that followed, the hearing and the homecoming, the investigation into Craig Holden moved through the county system with the methodical thoroughness that Art Decker had promised it would. Holden had resigned the day after the board session, and his formal resignation letter cited personal health reasons, but the timing told a different story. The Oversight Committee received Art's documented evidence package and assigned it to a senior investigator named Paulson, who had a reputation for following things to their conclusion regardless of where the conclusion went. Art kept Wade informed at intervals, calling on Tuesday evenings with brief updates delivered in the same measured tone he used for everything. Paulson found the original case files, Art said on one such call in late August. All 3 of them. The closures are as I described them. The committee has requested the bank records directly now. That takes them out of my chain and into the official record. Good, Wade said. Holden will have an attorney by now who is telling him to say as little as possible. That's the right advice for him, but it doesn't change the documentation. The documentation doesn't need him to say anything. And Paula's attorney, the law firm, they will argue that the wire transfers were unrelated to the case closures. That argument fails when you look at the timeline. Each transfer arrived within 7 days of each closure. No other transfers from that account to Holden's account exist. No other closures by Holden within that kind of time frame exist on any other case in his file. Art paused. It's a clean evidentiary chain. Paulson knows it. Wade was quiet for a moment. Art, I want you to know what you did matters. Art was quiet on his end of the line for a moment, too. That girl matters, Art said finally. The rest is just paperwork. Paula Sloan entered a second treatment program in September and completed it in November. Her attorney filed a renewed petition for some form of contact, which was assigned to a hearing in early spring. Diane flagged the petition and called Wade when it came through. What does it mean? Wade asked. It means she has the right to request the court consider some form of supervised contact, Diane said carefully. It does not mean she will get it. The investigation into the case closures is now in the record. The emergency room visit is in the record. The judge assigned to the spring hearing has seen both. She paused. I want you to understand your position is strong, but you should have an attorney present at the spring hearing. Wade called Roy that evening. Roy called 3 people and called Wade back in 45 minutes with the name of a family law attorney in Reading named Ellen Graves, who had represented a club member's daughter in a custody matter 2 years earlier and had done well. Ellen Graves met with Wade in her office on California Street the following week. She was a compact, brisk woman in her mid-40s with the focused intelligence of someone who had learned to read a situation in its first 5 minutes and act on what she read. She reviewed the file. She asked questions. She took notes in a precise small hand that filled half a legal pad. "Your position is strong," she said at the end of the meeting, which was the same thing Diane had said, and which Wade was beginning to believe. "The adoption approval from the county board is on record. The investigation into Holden and the case closure pattern is on record. The 14 supervised visits and the documented behavioral improvement in the child are on record. Your completion of all required training and evaluation is on record." She set down her pen. "Paula Sloan's attorney is going to argue maternal bond in the disruption of family reunification. I am going to argue documented pattern of neglect abandonment in the 3 prior reports that should have resulted in intervention 18 months ago. And the spring hearing, we go in and we tell the truth," Ellen Graves said. "That seems to be working well for you so far." Wade almost smiled. "Yeah, someone else told me the same thing." The spring hearing came in March. It was a different kind of room from the county board session. Smaller, more formal, with a judge rather than a committee. Ellen Graves sat beside Wade, and Diane Mercer provided a written assessment. Paula Sloan sat with her attorney across a narrow aisle. The judge reviewed the materials. He asked direct questions of both parties. He was unhurried and thorough and gave away nothing in his expression. The petition for supervised contact was denied without prejudice, meaning Paula could reapply after a period of time if circumstances changed substantially. Wade and Ellen Graves walked out of the courthouse together. Ellen shook his hand once and told him he had a strong case going forward and to call her if anything changed. Wade drove home and found Roy sitting at his kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and the expectant expression of someone who had been waiting for news. "Denied," Wade said. Roy picked up his coffee. "Good." They drank the coffee and did not need to say much else. Nora had not been present at either hearing. She was in school for both. This was intentional and discussed in advance. Diane had been clear that the most important thing for the child was the ordinary continuity of her daily life, and that the legal proceedings, while consequential, were the adult's business to manage. Nora knew in the way that children know things that important things were happening in the background of her life in those months. She did not ask directly about Paula. She asked once in November whether her mother was going to come back. Wade sat across from her at the kitchen table and thought about all the comfortable things he could say and said none of them. "She's not coming here," he said. "This is your home. That's not changing." Nora looked at him steadily. "What about her?" she said. Wade was quiet for a moment. "She's getting help," he said. "She's trying to do better. But that doesn't change where you live or where you belong. You're here. You're staying here." Nora was quiet for a moment, too, thinking about this. "Okay," she said. That was how she handled most things. She took the information in. She thought about it with her full attention. She arrived at a position. She said, "Okay," or she said what she thought, or she asked a follow-up question. She did not spiral, and she did not catastrophize, and she did not need to be reassured past the point where the reassurance matched the reality. She was, Wade had come to understand a very practical person. This made sense. When practical thinking is the thing that keeps you safe in the world, you develop it early and rely on it thoroughly. He admired it in her. He recognized it in himself. Christmas arrived with the particular quality of a first Christmas. In a new configuration, slightly tentative, slightly overplanned, compensating for the strangeness with extra attention to detail. Wade had not decorated a Christmas tree in at least 12 years, possibly longer. He bought one from the lot on Market Street the second week of December, a 5-foot Douglas fir that smelled like the forest where he had found Nora, which he chose not to comment on. They decorated it together on a Saturday evening. Roy came by and contributed tinsel with the enthusiastic excess of a man who has strong opinions about tinsel and no one to moderate them. Martha Pennington brought over a box of ornaments that she said she had been meaning to pass along for years, glass bulbs in red and green and gold that had belonged to her late mother, and she sat in the armchair by the window and directed where each one should go with the quiet authority of someone who knows exactly how a Christmas tree should look and is entirely willing to share this knowledge. Nora took the ornament placement very seriously. She held each glass ball up to the butterfly lamp to see the light come through the color before she decided where on the tree it belonged. This process took considerably longer than it might have, but produced, Martha said, the most thoughtfully arranged Christmas tree she had seen in recent memory. Roy was given the tinsel and instructed to apply it evenly. He applied it excessively and unevenly, and Nora redistributed it with patient, meticulous exactness, while Roy watched with the expression of someone who has been corrected by a 7-year-old and finds this entirely acceptable. On Christmas morning, Nora came into the living room at 6:45 in her pajamas and stood in front of the tree and looked at it in the early gray light for a long moment before she did anything else. Wade was already awake, sitting in the armchair with his coffee, watching her look at the tree. She turned to look at him. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." She looked back at the tree. "It came out good," she said. "Yeah," Wade said, "it did." She sat beside him in the armchair, which was not quite big enough for both of them, but was managed by the simple fact that she was small, and he was willing to move over as far as the armchair allowed. They sat together and looked at the Christmas tree in the early gray light with the butterfly lamp on behind them and the coffee warming Wade's hands, and outside the window, the Reading winter morning beginning to arrive. Roy came at 10 with food enough for 6 people and the unshakable good cheer of someone who finds Christmas straightforwardly excellent and sees no reason to complicate this position. Martha Pennington came at noon with pie and sat in the armchair and talked to Nora about books because they had discovered in November that they shared the specific and serious pleasure of reading stories about animals who turned out to have more complicated inner lives than anyone expected. Art Decker called in the early afternoon to say Happy Christmas and to report that the DA's office had formally issued charges against Holden on December 22nd. The case would take time to work through the courts, as these things did, but the charges were solid and the documentation was complete, and there was a reason for it. "Good," Wade said. "Merry Christmas, Callahan," Art said. "Merry Christmas, Art." Nora watched Wade put the phone down and then watched his face for a moment with that careful attention she gave to everything. "Was that good news?" she asked. "Yeah," Wade said. "That was good news." She nodded, filed this, and went back to the book she was reading, a new one Martha Pennington had brought. The adoption was finalized in a courthouse downtown on a Wednesday morning in February. The hearing was brief and procedural and entirely anticlimactic in the way that formal endings to long processes often are. A judge said the necessary things. Ellen Graves had the paperwork in order. Diane Mercer attended and sat in the back of the small courtroom. Wade and Nora sat at the table together. Nora wore the blue dress that she had chosen herself from the rack at the department store on Bocelli Lane 2 days earlier, after considering and ruling out a yellow one, and a red one, and a green one that was the wrong shade of green. The blue dress had small white flowers on the collar, and she had decided within 30 seconds of seeing it that it was the correct dress for this specific occasion. When the judge said what he had to say and signed what he needed to sign, Nora looked at Wade. "Is that it?" she said. "That's it." She thought about this. "It doesn't feel that different," she said. "From what?" "From yesterday." Wade looked at her. "Is that bad?" She considered the question seriously. "No," she said. "Yesterday was good, so it makes sense that today feels like yesterday." The logic of this was sound, and he told her so. Diane Mercer came out of the courtroom behind them and touched Wade's arm briefly as they walked into the courthouse hallway. She did not say anything. She had said what she needed to say in the hearing room on the morning of the county board session months ago, and it had been enough. She just touched his arm once and then walked in a different direction. Roy had taken the morning off from wherever Roy was supposed to be and was waiting outside the courthouse with coffee and paper cups, 2 of them, which he distributed with the satisfied efficiency of a man who has planned this correctly. Nora accepted the coffee, looked at it, and handed it back to Roy. "I don't drink coffee," she told him. Roy looked at Wade. Wade shrugged. Roy drank both cups with the expression of someone adapting gracefully to new information. Spring arrived in Reading with the particular relief of a long winter ending, though the winter had not been that long or especially hard. The hills went green in March and stayed green through April in a way that felt like generosity. The Sacramento River ran high and fast from the snow melt in the mountains, and on one Saturday in April, Wade drove Nora up to Shasta Dam to see the lake high and full and the spillway running. Nora stood at the railing and looked at the water for a long time. "It's very big," she said. "Yeah. Is it always this big?" "It depends on the year. This year it's big." She thought about this. "Is it because of the snow?" The snow melts in spring and flows down into the lake. She considered the water for another moment. Where does it go after? Down into the Sacramento River, all the way to the bay, San Francisco Bay. Eventually, she was quiet for a moment, following the water in her mind from the mountains down through the valley and out to the bay. That's very far, she said. Yeah, Wade said, it is. She looked at the water a while longer and then turned away from the railing with the definitive manner of someone who has finished looking at something and is ready for what is next. On the drive back down Route 299 toward Redding, she sat in the passenger seat and watched the pines and the curves of the road with the alert eyes that were simply who she was. And they passed the turnoff near Crystal Creek the way they had passed it in October, and this time Nora did not say anything as they went by it. She just looked at it briefly and then looked back at the road ahead. Wade noticed and said nothing. Some things did not need to be discussed every time they came up. Some things you just drove past together and kept going. In May, Roy's younger sister Carla came to Redding from Sacramento for a weekend visit and met Nora for the first time. Carla was 40 years old and worked as a dental hygienist and was, in Roy's assessment, significantly smarter and more capable than him in every relevant area. Nora and Carla spent 45 minutes on Saturday afternoon discussing the relative merits of various series of books about children who discover they have unexpected abilities. And Carla recommended 3 additional titles that Nora wrote down in the small notebook she carried in the pocket of her jacket for exactly this kind of information. Roy watched this exchange from across the kitchen table with the proud expression of a man whose family members are getting along with the people who matter to him. Wade watched from the doorway and thought that this was what it looked like, the thing that had been hollowing him out for years, the thing he had not been able to name. It looked like a kitchen on a Saturday afternoon with people in it. It looked like someone writing down the titles of books. It looked like ordinary life given its full weight. That summer, the first summer of Nora being officially his, Wade began teaching her about motorcycles. Not riding, she was too small to ride, but understanding. He started in the garage on a Sunday morning in June with the Harley up on the stand and Nora sitting on a stool beside it with the serious, focused attention she brought to anything she had decided to learn. He showed her the engine. He explained in simple terms how the pistons moved and what the cylinders did and where the fuel went and how the spark made the whole thing happen. She asked questions that were precise and specific and occasionally revealed that she had already understood more of it than he had credited her for. It's like a really loud heart, she said at one point. Wade looked at the engine for a moment. Yeah, he said, kind of. She thought about this. What happens if the heart stops? You fix it, Wade said. What if you can't fix it? He looked at her. She was asking about the motorcycle, but she was also asking about something else, which was fine. She was allowed to ask about both at the same time. Then you find out what went wrong and you don't let it go wrong that way again, he said. She nodded slowly as if this was an acceptable answer to both questions. They spent 4 Sunday mornings in the garage that summer, Nora on the stool, and Wade explaining and showing, and sometimes just letting her ask questions and following wherever the questions went. By the end of the summer, she knew the names of the main components of the engine, and she could identify what most of the tools on the pegboard were for, and she understood that the sound the engine made was not random, but was the sound of a very precise series of things happening in the right order at the right time. On the last Sunday in August, sitting in the garage in the late afternoon with the heat finally leaving the day and the smell of the pine hills coming in through the open door, Nora sat on the stool and looked at the Harley on the stand and said something that stopped Wade where he was. When I'm big enough, she said, will you teach me to ride? He looked at her sitting on the stool with her feet not quite reaching the floor, 8 years old now, wearing the pink sneakers with white laces that were on their second pair because she had worn the first pair through in 6 months. Yeah, Wade said, when you're big enough. She nodded, decision made, filed away for future reference. The world on Hilltop Drive settled into its particular rhythms. Sunday cookies from Martha, twice weekly visits from Roy with groceries and cards, and the easy warmth that had become one of the reliable textures of their life. Bedtime chapters from whatever book they were currently reading, which cycled through several series in one significant detour into a very long book about a girl who could speak to horses, which Nora read mostly herself and reported on in summary during dinner. Diane came by every month now, less formally than the early check-ins, more like someone visiting people she had come to be glad knew each other. Art Decker called every few weeks with updates on the Holden case, which was moving through the court system with the slow inevitability of a case where the documentation is complete and the charges are solid. It would eventually resolve, Art said, the way these things resolved when you had done the paperwork correctly. Boyd Garrett called in September to say that two members of the Reading chapter had asked about the foster care process after seeing what Wade had done. He said this without particular inflection, simply as information. Wade listened to it and understood what it meant without needing it explained. The first anniversary of finding Nora came on a July afternoon. Wade had not marked it on any calendar, but he knew what day it was. He thought about it in the morning without saying anything. At dinner that evening, Nora set down her fork and looked at him with the direct, clear look she had when she had something to say that she had been thinking about for a while. "Last year," she said, "you found me." "Yeah," Wade said, "in the woods." "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "I think about it sometimes," she said. "The tree I was sitting under, and how it was all dark in the woods and I was scared." Wade waited. "And then you came through the bushes," she said, "and you were very big and I was scared of you. And then you gave me water." "Yeah," Wade said. She picked up her fork and then set it down again. "I'm glad you were the one who heard me," she said. Wade looked at her. "I'm glad I was the one who heard you," he said. She picked up her fork again, and they finished dinner, and the summer evening came through the open kitchen window, and the butterfly lamp made its soft light from the hallway, and Roy came by at 7:30 with his customary lack of advance notice, and the evening went the way evenings went, in that house with cards and juice, and the particular comfortable noise of people who belonged to the same place. In the fall, Nora started second grade at Pioneer Elementary, 3 blocks from Hilltop Drive, in the school where Martha Pennington had taught for 31 years, and where the current principal, a tall man named Garrett, who had been a student there himself decades ago, shook Wade's hand on the first day with a grip that communicated something about knowing who Wade was and having no particular problem with it. Nora's second grade teacher was a young woman named Miss Aldrich, who kept a shelf of paperback novels along the back of the classroom for students to borrow, and who had within 3 weeks identified Nora as someone who was going to need a substantially more challenging reading list than the standard curriculum provided, and had begun quietly supplying one. Nora came home one October afternoon with a book Miss Aldrich had recommended, a novel written for adults, but considered appropriate for a serious young reader, and announced at dinner that she was going to read it, and that Wade should read it too, so they could discuss it. He agreed. He bought his own copy the next day. It took Nora 10 days to read it. It took Wade 3 weeks. They discussed it across 2 separate evenings, sitting on the couch with the butterfly lamp on and the fall rain against the windows, which was the best kind of evening for discussing a book. The second book Miss Aldrich recommended Wade read at the same pace as Nora, 5 pages a night, so that the discussions could happen in real time rather than in retrospect. This was how he became, in his mid-40s, an attentive and serious reader of books he never would have encountered otherwise, guided by an 8-year-old girl with precise literary opinions and the direct communication style of someone who did not see the value in softening a critical assessment. The world outside Hilltop Drive continued doing what it did. The investigation into Craig Holden concluded in November with a guilty plea on 2 of the 4 original charges and a sentencing hearing scheduled for spring. Art Decker called with the news on a Tuesday evening and said that while the plea was on reduced charges, it was still a meaningful outcome, and the record would reflect what had happened. Paula Sloan completed another program, and her attorney filed again in the spring as expected. The hearing was brief. Ellen Graves appeared with the complete documented record of the case closures and the investigation and the formal adoption judgment. The petition was again denied, with the judge noting in his written decision that the stability of the child's current placement was the paramount consideration and that the documented history gave the court no basis to disrupt it. Wade received the news by phone from Ellen Graves on a Thursday afternoon while he was at the machine shop. "Same result," Ellen said. "Denied. You may want to prepare for the possibility of further filings over the coming years. Her attorney will keep trying as long as she keeps asking. But the record is getting longer, and the record favors you." "Understood," Wade said. He went back to the engine he had been working on. He finished it and washed his hands and drove home and made dinner, and Nora came home from school with a drawing she had made of a horse, which she presented for his assessment with the critical detachment of an artist who wants honest feedback. "The legs look a little stiff," he said. "I know," she said. "Legs are hard. The head is good." She looked at the drawing. "The head is good," she agreed. She rolled it up and put it in the cardboard tube she kept for drawings she was not finished thinking about yet, and went to wash her hands for dinner. That was life. That was what it looked like from the inside, close up, in the ordinary accumulation of days. a drawing of a horse, hands washed before dinner, a book read in 5-page installments, the butterfly lamp, the Sunday cookies, Roy with groceries twice a week, the machine shop on Hartnell Avenue, the sound of someone moving around in the room down the hall. Wade had been trying to name for years what it was that the open road gave him, and then took back what he was riding toward and never reaching what the empty parking lot at the end of every road was the absence of. He had it now. He had known it since that first night when Nora slept against his arm on the couch and he sat completely still and did not move and did not want to be anywhere else in the world. It was this, just this. A house with someone in it, a door left open one hand's width, a voice down the hall asking what's for breakfast. The ordinary weight of being expected somewhere and being present when expected. He had ridden through 20 years of highway looking for it. He had found it in 11 minutes of walking through manzanita and dry pine duff to the base of an old oak tree in the forest, where a girl with pale green eyes and dirt on her face had looked at him the way no one had ever looked at him before. With hope. She had been right to hope. He had shown up. He was still showing up. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was everything. On the second summer in August, Roy organized a small gathering at the house. Not a party exactly. 20 people more or less from the Reading chapter, and a few others who had been among the 63 at the courthouse the previous July. They came in the early evening when the heat had softened, and the pine smell came down from the hills, and they sat in the backyard, in the garage, and drank cold beer and ate from the grill that Roy had commandeered and maintained with the focused intensity of a man who takes outdoor cooking seriously. Nora moved through the gathering with the calm self-possession of someone who has decided that a yard full of large tattooed men is not a thing that requires particular management. She knew Roy and she knew several of the others by name, and she navigated introductions with the direct politeness she brought to everything. At some point, she was sitting in the garage on her stool with Boyd Garrett standing beside her looking at the Harley on its stand. Boyd was pointing out something about the engine configuration, and Nora was listening with her full attention and asking questions. Wade watched this from the doorway. Boyd Garrett, chapter president, 56 years old, who had told him that he would bring heat on the club and that everything was about how things operated, was standing in Wade's garage, explaining motorcycle engines to an 8-year-old girl with the patient thoroughness of someone who takes the questions seriously. Roy appeared at Wade's shoulder. "You see that?" Roy said. "Yeah," Wade said. "She's going to know more about engines than both of us by the time she's 12. "Probably," Wade said. Roy was quiet for a moment, watching Boyd and Nora at the Harley. "You did good," Roy said. Wade looked at his friend. "We did," he said. Roy considered this. He was not a man who accepted credit generously when he felt it was more accurate to distribute it elsewhere, but in this case, he was willing to let it stand because it was true. "Yeah," Roy said, "we did." The evening went on into the dark, and the stars came out over Reading, and the pine hills were dark shapes against a darker sky, and the voices from the yard were the comfortable voices of people who have nothing to prove to each other and know where they need to be more than where they are. Nora fell asleep on the couch sometime around 9 o'clock. Still in her sneakers, one arm across the worn stuffed bear she had brought with her on the first day, and which still lived on her bed, and which she had not explained and did not need to. Wade covered her with the blanket that lived on the couch for exactly this kind of occasion, and left the butterfly lamp on its lowest setting in the hall, and went back out to sit in the yard with Roy and the others in the summer dark. He sat there for a long time listening to the voices around him, and the crickets in the grass, and somewhere distant, the sound of a motorcycle on the highway going north, and thought about nothing in particular, which was a different kind of nothing from the nothing that had been in him before. This nothing was full. This nothing was the sound of a life that fit the shape it had been given, or perhaps more accurately had grown to fit the shape of what had arrived unbidden in the woods on a July afternoon and had stayed. He sat in the yard until the guests went home in 2s and 3s, and then Roy stayed for one more beer. And then Roy went home too, and the house on Hilltop Drive was quiet. Wade turned off the lights and went inside and checked that the door was locked and the windows were latched the way they always were. He looked in on Nora, still asleep on the couch with her sneakers on and the stuffed bear. He pulled the blanket up slightly. He turned off the lamp in the hallway, the butterfly lamp, then turned it back on at its lowest setting. He stood in the hallway for a moment in the soft light. Then he went to bed. Outside, the night continued doing what nights did. The pine hills held the dark. The Sacramento River ran through the valley to the south, moving toward the bay the way it always had. The roads ran out from Redding in every direction, north and south and east and west, the way roads always did, leading everywhere and somewhere and here. Here was where Wade Callahan was. Here was where he was going to be. That was the whole story, and it was enough. The days before the complaint investigation concluded were the longest Hank could remember since the early years of the chapter, when he had still been learning the patience that running with a group requires, the ability to wait for things to resolve themselves on schedules other than your own. He spent most of his time in the garage on Hilltop Drive. The garage was not a large space, perhaps 20 feet by 16, with a concrete floor that had been poured sometime in the 60s and had developed its own topography of cracks and stains and settled impressions over the decades since. He had organized it carefully in the first weeks after moving in, hung tools in order on the pegboard wall labeled the bins of fasteners and fittings, built a rolling workbench from materials he found at the salvage yard on Caterpillar Road. It was the most organized space in his life, and it was the space he retreated to when the rest of his life felt disordered. He worked on the shovel head carburetor through 3 evenings. When it was finished, he tuned it, then found something else that needed attention, then found something after that. He was working his way around the garage in the systematic way of a man who needs his hands occupied so that his mind can go where it needs to go without being interrupted. He thought about Rosie a great deal. He thought about the specific quality of her attention, the way she looked at things she was curious about, the way she had looked at the butterfly lamp in the yellow room on the day he had installed it, standing in the doorway of the room with her arms at her sides, not going in but not looking away, either studying it with the patient intensity of someone committing something to memory before allowing themselves to trust that it will still be there tomorrow. He understood that kind of looking. He had done it himself as a boy. In the house in Shasta County where he had grown up, certainty had been intermittent. Good evenings and difficult ones arrived on no schedule that a child could learn to predict, which meant that good things had to be held in the memory, carefully recorded precisely, so that when they disappeared, there was something to refer back to. He had not thought about his childhood deliberately in years. The garage gave him the particular kind of solitude in which things surface, that do not surface in company, and in that solitude the memories came up the way objects come to the surface of still water, things that have been below for a long time and arrive without announcement. He remembered being 11 the year his mother died. Her name had been Carol. She had been a small woman with dark hair and quick hands, and a laugh that filled whatever room she was in with a specific energy that was entirely her own, a laugh that did not require explanation or context, that was simply present the way light is present. When she died in the hospital in October from a kidney infection that a doctor in a better-funded county might have caught 3 days earlier, the house had gone quiet in a way that Hank had not understood at the time, but that he understood now as the silence of a structure losing its central beam. Frank Briggs had tried. This was something Hank had not allowed himself to acknowledge for most of his adult life, because it was easier to hold the narrative clean and simple. The absent father, the failure of care, the childhood made of lack. But alone in the garage in the evenings with his hands on metal and his thoughts unguarded, he could see it more honestly. Frank had tried, and he had not been equal to what the trying required, and the distance between those two things had been the distance inside which a boy had grown up without enough of what he needed. He had left at 14. He had not said goodbye. He had taken the $40 from the coffee can where Frank kept the household money, and he had left before dawn on a November morning, and he had never gone back, and for a long time he had told himself that leaving was a form of survival, and survival was a sufficient justification for whatever it required. He still believed this, but he had stopped believing that the story ended there. He had been a child who needed someone to come back, and no one had. He set down the wrench he was holding and looked at the garage wall, at the organized tools on the pegboard, at the labeled bins, and the clean concrete floor, and the single bulb casting its yellow light over everything. He thought about a girl who had asked him with the direct simplicity of absolute exhaustion not to leave. He thought about what it meant that he was the first person in her life to have heard that request and answered it with a presence she could feel. He went back to work. On the 6th day of the investigation, Carol Withers called and told him that her report would conclude with a finding of unsubstantiated. She said it in a neutral, professional tone that carried no warmth and no particular investment in how he received the information, which was the right way to deliver it in which he appreciated. That evening, Wade came by with a paper bag that contained sandwiches from the deli on Pine Street and sat on the workbench stool while Hank sat on the rolling work chair, and they ate without talking much, which was sometimes the most comfortable way to be with someone you had known long enough that silence required no explanation. After a while, Wade said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it straight." "All right. The guys who showed up for you, the ones who are coming on Thursday. It's not just loyalty. Hank, some of those men have kids. Some of them have kids they don't see anymore. Some of them lost things they can't get back, and they ride because the road is the only place they know how to put it. What you're doing with that girl, they understand what it is. Not everybody can name it, but they feel it. It's the thing they wish someone had done." Hank looked at his sandwich. "Some of them told me that he asked." Wade shrugged. "A few said it. Most of them just said they were coming." Hank nodded slowly. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. "Wade waited. That first day, when I found her in the woods. She was so tired she couldn't even be properly afraid of me. She looked at me like I was the only thing available. Not even like I was safe, just like I was there. And she said she'd been hiding all night because she was scared of the dark. She was scared of the dark, but she was alone in it. And I just keep thinking, how does a 7-year-old girl spend a night alone in the woods, scared of the dark, and still be sitting there in the morning? She just stayed." Wade was quiet for a moment. "Because she didn't have anywhere else to go," he said. "I know," Hank said. "But she could have given up. She could have stopped. She stayed. She was still there in the morning." Wade looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "She was still there. And so were you." Hank finished his sandwich. They sat for a while longer in the garage with the single bulb overhead and the smell of oil and metal and the sound of the street outside traffic moving on Hilltop Drive, someone's sprinklers turning on 3 houses down, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening in a town that did not know it was about to be part of a story. On the morning of the hearing, before the sound of the motorcycles arrived, Hank had sat in the kitchen and done something he had not done in many years. He had written a list, not a list of things to do, nothing practical, a list of things he intended. He wrote it on the back of an envelope from the county building in the small, deliberate handwriting of a man who writes rarely, but carefully when he does. He wrote, "I will be there when she wakes up. I will be there when she goes to sleep. I will not make promises I cannot keep, and I will keep the ones I make. I will learn what she needs, and I will provide it. I will not leave." He folded the envelope and put it in the breast pocket of the button-down shirt and drove to the courthouse. The envelope was still in his pocket when the vote came in. He had not read it again during the hearing. He had not needed to. The first enemy arrived that same week. A local television station in Reading ran a 90-second segment about the rescue. Hells Angels biker finds abandoned child in Shasta County woods. The piece was factual, but its tone carried an undercurrent of suspicion that Hank could feel even through the small screen of his phone, like a vibration below the audible range. Comments on the station's website split immediately and argued with each other through the night. Some people called him a hero. Others questioned his motives with a specificity that suggested they had already arrived at conclusions and were working backward toward evidence. Hank read 3 comments and put his phone face down on the kitchen table. The second enemy arrived in person 4 days later. Earl Boone ran the Reading chapter from a converted warehouse on East Side Road with iron gates and 2 security cameras positioned to cover every approach. He was 54, lean and deliberate, with a habit of keeping his voice at a conversational level, regardless of the content of what he was saying, which made him harder to read than men who shouted. His eyes were the color of creek water in November, and they missed very little. Hank sat across the desk from him in the office at the back of the warehouse. Motor oil and sawdust and old coffee smells. A Polaroid photograph of the chapter on a California run 6 years ago pinned to the wall above the desk. Hank in the back row, younger and harder looking, not smiling. "I heard you're filing to foster a kid," Earl said. "That's right. You understand how that looks for the chapter. I understand how it looks for Rosie Carver if nobody steps up." Earl's fingers drummed once on the desk, then stopped. "You're going to bring attention on us, Hank. Media attention, social workers, county officials poking around our operations. That is not beneficial. This isn't about operations. Everything touches operations." Hank stood, his chair scraped back on the concrete floor. "Not this," he said, "not this time." He walked out of the warehouse and through the iron gate and did not look back. He felt the gate close behind him and understood without having to think about it carefully that something larger than a gate had closed. He had been a member of this chapter for 20 years. He had built his identity inside its structure, its hierarchy, its code of loyalty and silence. Walking away from that conversation felt like pulling a nail from load-bearing wood. But Rosie had been alone in those woods for more than a night, and that fact had rearranged every other fact in his life according to a new priority he had not chosen and could not undo. The foster care application process moved with the grinding deliberateness of a bureaucracy designed above all else for caution. Hank understood this. He did not like it, but he understood it. The background check took 9 days and came back flagged with 2 misdemeanor arrests. The bar fight in Sacramento in 2009, which had involved 3 other people and a dispute over a pool table, and had ended with Hank spending 1 night in county holding. The trespassing charge in Eureka in 2014, which had involved a piece of private land whose boundary markers had been neither visible nor logical. Neither arrest had resulted in a conviction. Neither was an automatic disqualifier. Both required documentation and explanation, which Hank provided in writing in the flat, factual language of someone who was not apologizing for his past, but was not pretending it away either. He attended the 3 mandatory foster parent training sessions in a county building on Cypress Avenue. The room held 12 people at the first session, 9 at the second, 11 at the third. Married couples mostly and single women of various ages. They looked at Hank the way you look at something in a museum that you were not expecting to find in this particular wing, with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty about what the appropriate response was. He sat in his plastic chair and paid attention. He took notes in a small spiral notebook he had bought at the drugstore on the way over. Some of what they taught he already knew in the way you know things that were never formally taught to you from experience, from watching from having been a child in a failing situation and having observed closely and involuntarily how adults behaved when things were going wrong. Some of what they taught was new. He wrote it down. Between the second and third sessions, he drove to the house on Hilltop Drive and stood in the doorway of the spare bedroom, which had been used for storage since he moved in 3 years ago. It held a broken shelf unit, 2 boxes of motorcycle magazines, a water heater that had been removed and never disposed of, and a significant quantity of things that could not be identified without moving other things first. He spent a weekend clearing it out. He took the magazines to the county recycling facility and the water heater to the metal yard on Old Oregon Trail, and the unidentifiable things to the dumpster at the end of the block. Then he painted the walls. He chose a pale yellow from the hardware store on Market Street because the can said it was called Morning Light and because something about that seemed right for a room that needed to start over. He bought a bed frame and mattress from the furniture clearance place on Hartnell Avenue, a dresser with 4 working drawers from the thrift store on California Street, and a lamp from that same thrift store whose shade had small painted butterflies on it in colors that had faded to something gentle and muted. The cashier at the thrift store, a young man with a name tag that said Brandon, stared at Hank for a long moment while ringing up the lamp and then looked back at his register without saying what he had been thinking. Hank carried the lamp to his truck and drove home and put it in the yellow room and plugged it in and turned it on and stood in the doorway looking at the light it made on the pale walls. He stood there for a while. Donna Keller conducted the home inspection herself. She arrived on a Wednesday morning with her clipboard and her reading glasses and the professional composure of someone who had done this many times and knew how to look at a house without looking through a person. She moved through each room with a methodical efficiency, checking window locks, examining the refrigerator's contents, noting the smoke detectors in the cabinet where Hank stored his medications, a blood pressure prescription and aspirin. Nothing remarkable. She asked him about his daily routine and about his income, which came from a combination of motorcycle repair work done through a shop on Hilltop Avenue and occasional contract work on larger engine jobs referred through the chapter. She asked about his support network. He named Wade Fletcher, who had already agreed to be a reference, and Agnes Ford, his retired neighbor 3 houses down, who had appeared at his door 2 weeks earlier with a plate of oatmeal cookies and an air of having made a decision. Agnes Ford was 71 years old with white hair cut short and practical and eyes that were sharp and undeceived behind her reading glasses. She had lived on Hilltop Drive for 26 years, and she had watched Hank come and go from the house 3 properties down for 3 of those years with the careful attention of someone who has learned to form opinions slowly and hold them firmly. She had brought the cookies because she had seen the news segment and because she had watched him clean out that spare room through her kitchen window and because she had decided on the available evidence that she knew what kind of man he was, regardless of the patches he wore. He's doing it right, Agnes had told Donna during her reference call in a tone that did not invite counter-argument. I have watched that man sand and repaint a porch in 100-degree heat because a little girl was going to be living there. That is not a man performing. That is a man committed. Donna stood in the doorway of the yellow room on the morning of the home inspection. She looked at the butterfly lamp in the morning light walls, in the dresser with the handles that Hank had replaced because one of the originals was loose, and he had not wanted the drawer to be difficult to open. She wrote something on her clipboard. When they returned to the kitchen, she set the clipboard on the table and looked at him the way people look at things they did not expect to find where they found them. Why are you doing this? He had thought about how to answer this question. He had rehearsed several versions of the answer, some of them honest, and some of them strategic, and some of them somewhere between the two. He discarded all of them when the question arrived. Because somebody should have done it for me, and nobody did. He said. Donna looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the clipboard. The county board meets a week from Thursday, she said. I'll submit my recommendation before then. What will you recommend? She paused at the kitchen door. Approval, she said. Provisional with check-ins, but approval. 3 days before the hearing, Ray Decker came to Hilltop Drive. Hank was in the garage behind the house working on a carburetor that belonged to a customer's 1978 shovelhead when he heard footsteps on the gravel and looked up. The man who appeared in the garage doorway was about 40 broad through the shoulders, wearing a clean button-down shirt that was doing the work of suggesting respectability without quite achieving it. His face was smooth and his hair was combed, and his hands were in his pockets in the casual way of a man who wants you to know his hands are in his pockets. Hank straightened up slowly. You Briggs? I am. Name's Ray Decker. I am a friend of Sheila Carver's. Hank set down the carburetor wrench. He did not say anything. He was familiar with this particular kind of conversation, the kind that presents itself as social and is not. Decker looked around the garage slowly. Engine parts, tools, the smell of oil. The yellow light from the single overhead bulb. Heard you're trying to take Sheila's girl, Decker said. I'm filing to be a foster parent. Decker nodded as if this were something he already knew. Just wanted to come by and say hello. Let you know Sheila has people in her corner. Good people. People with resources. That's good for Sheila. Could be good or not good for you, depending on choices you make. The words were perfectly conversational. The inflection did not change. The hands stayed in the pockets. Hank looked at him for a moment. I think we're done here, he said. Decker smiled. Sure, nice garage you got. He walked back across the gravel and out through the side gate, and Hank listened to his footsteps until they were gone. Then he stood in the garage for a long time, the carburetor on the bench beside him, the single bulb buzzing overhead, thinking about the weight of a threat that is never delivered as a threat and therefore cannot be responded to as one. He called Donna Keller that evening and told her about the visit. She was quiet for a moment. I'll note it in the file, she said. Mr. Briggs, I need to tell you something. 2 days ago, I received an anonymous complaint about you. The complaint alleges inappropriate behavior toward a minor. It is unspecific and it appears to come from someone who did not witness anything directly. We are required to investigate all complaints regardless of their apparent origin. Hank stood in his kitchen with the phone against his ear. I understand. It will delay the hearing by approximately 1 week while the investigation is completed. I want to be honest with you about that. Do you believe the complaint? Donna was quiet for 3 seconds. My job is to investigate, not to believe or disbelieve prior to investigation. But I will tell you that the timing and the nature of this complaint are consistent with someone attempting to interfere with your application. He thanked her and ended the call. He walked through the house and stood in the doorway of the yellow room with the butterfly lamp and the morning light walls and thought about a girl who had been in those woods alone for more than a day, who had drunk water from a bottle held by a stranger because she was too thirsty to be cautious, who had asked him with the directness of absolute exhaustion not to leave. He thought about what it meant that someone with resources and motivation was working to make sure she ended up with a woman who had left her alone in a rented trailer and then disappeared. He went back to the garage and worked on the carburetor until 2 in the morning. The investigation took 6 days. The investigator was a woman named Carol Withers from the County Oversight Office, professional and impartial, who interviewed Hank, twice interviewed Donna Keller, interviewed Deputy Marsh, and interviewed the three people at the social services office who had been present when Hank brought Rosie in. At the end of 6 days, she submitted a report that found no evidence of inappropriate behavior and characterized the complaint as unsubstantiated. During those 6 days, Hank was permitted to visit Rosie twice at the temporary foster home, where she was placed a house on Harley Road run by a county-approved couple named the Andersons. The visits lasted 2 hours each. The first visit, Rosie ran to the door when he arrived. She was wearing a shirt that was too big for her, and her hair had been combed, and she looked at him with an expression that was half relief and half the suspended tension of someone who has been told good news and is still waiting for the part where it turns out not to be true. They sat in the Andersons' backyard, which had a wooden picnic table and a bird feeder and a dog named Chester, who was very old and moved slowly between patches of shade. Rosie told Hank about Chester in some detail. She told him about the room she was sleeping in, which had curtains with flowers on them. She told him that she had been to the library. "You like libraries?" he asked. "I like the part where you can just sit there," she said, "and nobody tells you to leave." He thought about that for a long time after the visit. The second visit, Rosie showed him a picture she had drawn. It was in crayon on a piece of paper from the Andersons' printer. A large figure and a small figure standing beside something that was roughly oval and had lines coming out of it in a way that suggested it was a motorcycle, though the scale was approximate. "That's you and me," she said, pointing to the large figure. "And that's your motorcycle." "Yes, it is," Hank said. "I made the motorcycle orange because I didn't have a black one." "That's all right. I've thought about orange." She looked at him. "Can I come to your house?" "That's what we're working on." She nodded with the gravity of someone accepting a difficult but necessary fact. After the second visit, driving back to Hilltop Drive in his truck, Hank called Wade. "You need to know something," he said. Wade listened without interrupting, which by now was less surprising than it had been. When Hank finished, Wade was quiet for a moment. "This Decker," he said. "Ray Decker, Sheila's boyfriend. And you think he filed the complaint?" "I think the timing is not a coincidence." Wade said nothing for a moment. Then, "I've been making some calls." "I know. People are interested, more than I expected." Hank kept his eyes on the road. "Wade, I don't want anyone doing anything that makes this harder." "I know that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about showing up, being there, letting that board see who's standing behind you. Nothing else." Hank drove. "How many?" he asked. 73 confirmed, Wade said. "From Redding, Sacramento, Stockton, Fresno. Some guys from up near Chico. A few independents who heard through their own channels. 73 as of this morning. It'll probably be more by Thursday." Hank thought about the hearing room, the 5 board members, the fluorescent lights, Donna's clipboard. "Tell them to park legally," he said. "Tell them not to block anything. No noise, no confrontation, no reason to give anyone a problem they can point at." "Already said it," Wade told him. "These guys know Hank. They know what this is." On the evening before the hearing, Sheila Carver appeared at the Andersons' house during the window of supervised visitation that her attorney had arranged through the court. She arrived 20 minutes before the appointment was scheduled to begin, which was not permitted, and asked to see Rosie immediately, which was also not permitted. The Andersons called Donna Keller and kept the door closed. Sheila stood on the porch for 11 minutes before she left. Through the front window, pressed against the wall beside the curtain, Rosie had watched her mother stand on that porch. Carol Anderson had found her there and had not told her to move away from the window because sometimes you had to let a child see the truth in order for the truth to eventually stop having power over her. When the car left, Rosie had walked to the kitchen table and sat down and was very quiet for a long time. Chester, the old dog, walked over and put his head in her lap, and she put her hand on his head and sat there until dinner. The Andersons called Donna Keller a second time that evening. Donna added it to the file. Hank did not know about this until later. The night before the hearing, he sat in the living room of his house on Hilltop Drive with the lights on and Wade on the couch across from him, and they did not talk much about what was coming. They talked about other things, about a run they had taken to the coast 3 summers ago, about a guy named Pitcher who had fixed Wade's transmission for free once in a parking lot in Bakersfield, and whom neither of them had seen in years. They talked until midnight, and then Wade drove home, and Hank sat alone in the quiet house. He went to Rosie's room and stood in the doorway. The butterfly lamp was off. The morning light walls were gray in the dark. The dresser, with its replaced handles, stood against the wall, empty and waiting. He stood there for a while, then went to bed and did not sleep well, which was all right. There are nights when sleep is less important than staying present with the weight of what the next day holds. There were things Hank discovered about himself in the weeks after Rosie came to live on Hilltop Drive that he had not known before or had known in theory and was now knowing in practice, which is a different kind of knowing entirely. He discovered that he could wake up at any hour of the night and be fully present within seconds. This was not new for him. He had always been a light sleeper, trained by years of living in situations where the ability to come awake quickly was a practical advantage. What was new was the texture of that waking. Before Rosie, when something woke him, his body moved into a ready state alert and contained waiting to identify the threat and respond to it. Now when something woke him, the first thing he did was listen for her. The second thing was assess whether she was all right. The third thing, only if the first two were satisfied, was assess everything else. The reorganization of his priorities had happened so completely and so quickly that he noticed it only in retrospect, the way you notice a change in the weather only when someone mentions that it has been raining for days. He discovered that he had opinions about second-grade curriculum that he had not previously known he possessed. Rosie had missed significant time in school during the preceding year, and a half her attendance had been erratic in a way that correlated closely with Sheila Carver's periods of instability, and she was behind in reading and ahead in arithmetic, and her relationship with the idea of school itself was complicated. She was capable, clearly and obviously capable, and she knew this about herself in the way children know things about themselves when they are left alone with their own minds long enough that the opinion of others becomes less relevant than the evidence of their own experience. But school meant other children, and other children meant the kind of social territory that required a confidence she was still building. Hank sat with her in the evenings and worked through the county's catch-up materials with her, and read to her every night, and took her to the library on Saturdays and let her choose whatever she wanted, which was usually books about animals, particularly animals that migrated long distances by methods that seemed implausible, birds that navigated by stars, fish that returned to the exact creek where they were born, whales that sang to each other across hundreds of miles of ocean. He thought about why she was drawn to those stories. He did not say anything about it. He just kept taking her to the library. He discovered that he was capable of being moved by things he had not previously been moved by. A drawing she made of a horse, which was not a very accurate horse, but had been executed with the concentrated attention of someone who was trying to get something right. The way she handled a difficult moment when she spilled an entire glass of orange juice at breakfast one morning and went very still in the way of a child bracing for a reaction. And when the reaction did not come, when he simply got a towel and said it happens and cleaned it up, the way she slowly unknotted the way the tension drained out of her shoulders and her face by degrees. The way she had started leaving one of her drawings on his pillow some mornings, not saying anything about it, just placing it there. He had 6 of them now. He kept them on the dresser in his room. He discovered more slowly and with more difficulty that he was capable of asking for help. This was not a quality he had cultivated. His entire adult life had been organized around the premise that needing things from other people was a form of exposure. He could not afford that self-sufficiency, the kind built on pride and will, and the ability to solve problems through force or patience was the only reliable foundation. He had held this belief so long and so thoroughly that he had stopped examining it the way you stop examining a wall when you have lived inside it for long enough. Agnes Ford dismantled it with oatmeal cookies in complete casualness. It started the third Sunday when Agnes arrived with her plate and asked while sitting at the kitchen table whether Hank needed anything. He had started to say no thank you in the automatic way he said no thank you to all such questions, and then he had stopped. He had stopped because the question had arrived while Rosie was in the living room asking him to explain something in her homework that he did not fully understand himself. Something to do with the water cycle and the difference between precipitation and condensation, and he had been about to make up a plausible-sounding answer. He said instead, "Actually, Agnes, do you know anything about the water cycle?" Agnes looked at him for a moment, then looked at the living room door. She got up carrying her coffee and walked to where Rosie was sitting and sat down beside her and explained precipitation and condensation in a manner that was clear, accurate, and illustrated with a demonstration involving a glass of cold water and the kitchen air that Rosie found entirely convincing. After Agnes left that evening, Rosie said, "She's smart." "She is," Hank agreed. "Can she come back?" "She comes every Sunday." Rosie nodded, satisfied. After that, Hank started asking, not about everything, he was not built for that, but about specific things, the things where someone else's knowledge or capacity was genuinely more useful than his own pride in managing without it. He asked Donna Keller what signs to watch for that would indicate Rosie needed professional support beyond what he could provide at home. He asked the school counselor what strategies helped children who had experienced disrupted home environments feel safe in a classroom. He asked Wade one evening in the garage whether he thought Hank was doing any of this right. Wade looked at him over the top of a beer bottle. "You're asking me that question," he said. "That's how I know you're doing it right." The thing about Ray Decker did not go away entirely after the investigation concluded. He did not appear again at Hilltop Drive. There were no further anonymous complaints. The legal proceedings around Sheila Carver moved through the court system on their own timeline, and Gerald Roth filed several motions that were addressed and denied on various grounds, and eventually the proceedings reached a point at which the legal structure made it clear in the definitive language of documented court decisions that reunification with Sheila Carver was not going to be the outcome here. Hank did not take satisfaction in this in any simple way. He was aware that Sheila Carver was a person who had failed in her responsibilities through a combination of illness and circumstance and choices that had consequences she had not fully understood or had understood and had not been able to override. He was aware that she was someone's daughter, that she had her own history of being left with things that were too heavy to carry well. He did not think about her often. When he did, he thought about her without hatred, which had not always been the case, and which he recognized as a form of progress. What he thought about more was Rosie's relationship with that history and how she would carry it and what he could do to make sure she had the things she needed to carry it without it becoming the whole story of who she was. He talked to Donna Keller about this one afternoon in October after the formal adoption application had been submitted and they were in the period of waiting that was part of the process. He asked whether Rosie should see a therapist. Donna said that in her professional opinion, yes, at some point when Rosie indicated readiness, which would probably come in its own time, and which should not be forced, but should be made available and spoken about openly so that it did not become a thing freighted with the implication that something was wrong with her for needing it. He thought about how to speak about it openly. He thought about it for several days. One evening when they were reading a book about a young girl who trained horses on a ranch in Colorado, he stopped at the end of a chapter and said, "Rosie, I want to tell you something." She looked at him with the focused attention she brought to anything he said when his voice had a particular weight to it. He said, "Sometimes things happen to people when they're growing up that are too big to make sense of alone. And sometimes it helps to talk to someone whose job is to help people make sense of those kinds of things. Not because anything is wrong with you, because some things are just bigger than one person." Rosie looked at the book in her lap for a moment. "Like a therapist?" she asked. "You know about therapists. Mrs. Anderson took me to one after I came to her house." "Was that all right?" Rosie considered. She was quiet. She smelled like the lavender shampoo that was now on the second shelf in the bathroom at her height, and she had a small mark on her left wrist where she had caught it on the corner of the kitchen counter that morning and which had already faded to nothing. "She was nice," Rosie said. "She had a fish tank. Would you be okay with talking to someone like that again? If I found someone with a fish tank?" Rosie almost smiled. Maybe, she said, if she had a good one. He found a therapist named Dr. Patricia Garrow, who practiced on Cypress Avenue, 2 blocks from the social services building, whose waiting room contained a large saltwater tank with 3 clownfish in a small reef structure and a sea urchin that moved very slowly along the gravel bottom. Rosie stood in front of the tank for 2 full minutes on the first visit and then walked into Dr. Garrow's office without looking back, which Hank took as a positive sign. He sat in the waiting room and watched the clownfish and thought about all the things he had not known he would be doing a year ago. He thought about the pullout near Crystal Creek and the dirt path and the manzanita and a girl sitting against an oak tree with no shoes. He thought about the feeling of her arms around his neck when he had carried her out of the woods and the particular weightlessness of her 48 pounds against his shoulder, all of it trusting him not to drop her. He was still afraid sometimes of not being good enough at this. He thought this was probably the correct amount of fear to have. He had talked to Donna about it once, and she had said something he had written down in the same small notebook he had used for the training sessions. She had said the parents who worry about whether they're doing it right are usually doing it better than they think. It's the ones who are certain they're doing it right that I watch most carefully. He watched the clownfish move through the water. They darted and turned quick and certain, as if they knew exactly where they were going, as if the reef were familiar and the water were home. When Rosie came out 45 minutes later, she was carrying a small rubber fish that Dr. Garrow apparently gave to kids at the end of the first session. It was orange with white stripes, which made it a clownfish or close enough. How was it, he asked. She has pictures of Hawaii on her wall, Rosie said. She showed me where the clownfish actually live. That sounds good. She knows a lot about fish. He drove her home in the truck with the windows down because the October air was the kind that was exactly the right temperature, cool enough to feel like something, and warm enough not to require anything more than a jacket. And Rosie held the rubber clownfish in both hands and looked out the window at the hills going past with the expression she had when she was processing something not unhappy, just occupied. He did not ask what they had talked about in the office. He understood from something Donna had said and from his own instinct that the office was a space that needed to be protected, that its usefulness depended on it being hers and not something she had to report on to the adults around her. When they got home, she put the rubber clownfish on the windowsill of her bedroom between the butterfly lamp and the crayon drawing of a horse, and that was where it stayed visible from the doorway, orange and white against the morning light walls. The morning of the hearing arrived with a sky so clear and blue over Redding that it looked almost artificial, the kind of sky that belongs in a painting of California, rather than an actual California morning in late July. The heat was already building at 7, the sun pressing down on the valley with the patient insistence that had characterized the entire summer. Hank dressed carefully, clean jeans, the button-down shirt he had worn to church once 3 years ago at a funeral for a chapter member. He combed his hair and trimmed his beard in the bathroom mirror, looking at the scar along his jaw in the particular way you look at something you have stopped really seeing and are now seeing again. He had gotten that scar at 32 from a man whose name he no longer remembered clearly in a parking lot in Sacramento, that he no longer drove past if he could help it. The scar was part of the story that the world read when it looked at him. He could not change that story. He could only stand in front of the people reading it and be present in a way they did not expect. He left the leather vest on the door and walked out into the morning. He was driving his truck toward the courthouse at 8